Wait till the clock hits 6 o'clock on my computer.
Okay.
Okay, I am calling to order the Open Space Board of Trustees study session of February 24th, 2021. Welcome to all who have joined us either to watch or to listen. I will start as always with the roll call. Hal Hallstein.
I'm here.
Karen Holweg.
Here.
Dave Kuntz.
Here.
And Caroline Miller.
Here.
And I'm Kurt Brown. And so, Allison, that means we have a full house, all board members here tonight. Just to let the public know, this is an OSBT study session and not a regular meeting. Therefore, while we welcome anyone to watch and listen during the board's discussion, there is not a public comment period tonight. However, as always, we welcome your comments via email to the board, and you're also welcome to make public comments at any of our upcoming regular meetings, the next of which is March 10th. And with that, I will turn the gavel over to Vice Chair Hal Hallstein to give the overview of the meeting agenda and also to moderate the study session, as he and Karen have organized the agenda and the topics for tonight. So over to you, Hal.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Yes, so we have a couple different stages in the meeting. As people can see in the study session, we're going to start by having Dan give us an overview of the latest update on the OSBT and OSMP timeline and work plan. That's largely a verbal update, although some notes were included out of the recent subcommittee meeting notes, which were published online by the city. I thought we'd then, according to the agenda, review our historical motions as a board and the summary that's included, which is also in the packet. We also have the CU South briefing book and term sheet, which we want to make sure we're getting people's thoughts and ideas on. Then there's also included the specific documents related to the granite disposal, primarily as learning information about what form and shape disposal decisions have taken in the past and the type of specific legal language that has surrounded them. And then there's going to be some discussion about what, if anything, may be important for action in our official meeting in March. And then, hopefully we'll be wrapping up in about 2 hours around 8 o'clock. So if that sounds good to everyone, truthfully, I think Karen will be well situated to lead us particularly on the granite disposal documents and some other materials included in the packet on that. So I'll hand it off to her later in the meeting. But to get us going, Dan, do you want to begin by giving us the latest and greatest on the timeline and the new information from the subcommittee meeting?
Sure, thanks, Hal. And I think John is on the call as well. And as most of you know, John is tracking this project probably even a little bit more closely than I am on a day-to-day basis. So I welcome him to chime in at any point during this overview of what 2021, right now it's always fluid, but how it's setting up to be in terms of discussion. So as I alluded to at the last meeting, staff over the past, coming back off the holidays, one of the things that we heard from this board and from others and the process subcommittee and from each other was the need to sort of make sure we that the project team has sequenced out what 2021 looks like as best as that can be estimated at this time. And so there's a few weeks that was spent trying to develop that milestone schedule. And that was then communicated to project subcommittee on last Friday. And really without a lot of any tweaking, there were some questions from the process subcommittee council members on a few of the items. None of them had directly impacted the what has been sort of penciled in for OSBT potential meetings and subject matter. We walked out of there with that unchanged. I would just like to note that staff had originally had some of this first 2 months a little bit differently, but with the scheduling of this study session and then also estimating that the board's going to want to come back in March and do some other things, we took off one of the placeholders we put in for this type of discussion and put the 24th in its place. So recognize the 24th that went out as part of the schedule. Next month, we realize that there's probably going to be a desire for the board to return from study session to discussion to have another discussion. We would also still invite a conversation about this 2021 timeline and upcoming milestones. And again, I already had invited Joe and Phil to see if they could attend to answer any questions about the timeline. They're the project sponsors. And if you have any more sort of detailed questions about the overall timeline, that would be great for them to address. But tonight might suffice for what you guys want to know. And if that's the case, we probably won't repeat this conversation next March or this coming March. So March 10th is obviously on there. Then the next item that we thought was going to be of significant import to for the board and staff to have a discussion on is tentatively scheduled for Q2, middle of Q2 in June, late Q2. And that has to do with flood project impacts and environmental mitigation. And I'm just going to summarize this. And if John, if you want to fill in any details that you feel is pertinent to these subject matters, feel free. And then going into August, we felt like that would be a great time that we might have the information pretty much in hand to have a good discussion on the groundwater report and to provide and have a discussion on what the current conditions are saying and about some of the considerations that those current conditions are informing future design work that is going to have to be done to keep conditions as they are. So that's an August timeframe. And then based on prior motions, I believe this one might have come out from a 2018 motion from this board, is that at certain critical milestone design stages to come back and report to the board. And so this is that first one as we move into the preliminary design, and that's the 30% design phase. And so we're envisioning coming back to the board once that's completed and that team is ready to present. We're guessing would be in the middle of Q4, and which will have a great discussion on 30% design. And then we just wanted to put this TBD out there. Of course, it's consulting with you all on the best timing for this, but somewhere, assuming that something doesn't appear to trip the project up, which could be a number of different things, but for the scheduling sake, assuming that it doesn't, there will be, we'll need to land on what if there's a disposal request, what that timing might be preferred for this particular group to have disposal conversation, and leading up to disposal, what type of support, what type of information do you want to roll out? So we expect a conversation about not only the timing for that, but the rollout leading up to that and what that might look like for you all and how staff could support that. So I don't know, John, if you have anything to add to that overview, but that's sort of what 2021 is looking like from the staff's perspective for communicating out to the board.
Yeah, nothing really to add, Dan. That was a good overview. There are some key dates in there maybe for the board to at least focus on. One is the April 20th City Council meeting, which is tentative, and then the 30% design.
Yeah, about that April 20th, I attend this CAC meetings, the scheduling meetings, and there's two big items on for April 20th. And the CAC is recommending that staff look at splitting those two out. And one of them is this item. So just keep an eye on that one. That might change. It's going to stay within the same couple of weeks timeframe, but it may stay on the 20th or it may go out a week or two from that, depending on what happens at CAC scheduling.
Yeah, and maybe just one other thing to add, Dan, is it's really what we'll be looking to the board for feedback on in March 10th, or that was the plan. Is this, because there's a lot of dates in here that are tentative still, there is some uncertainty around the schedule, but is this the right order of things? So that would be one thing for you all to be considering.
I think with that overview, yeah, why don't we open it up to questions, comments, concerns? Why don't we start with you, Kurt?
I didn't get a real clear understanding during the discussion of what decision is being put to City Council at the 20th, or is that principally more council guidance into the annexation agreement process? I know we've got a bunch of to be determined dates for the CU Boulder revises application, draft annexation agreement release. Those are all to be determined. So what's your sense, Dan, as to what's going to be taken up during the April 20th meeting?
I think this is the initial touch about the term, where the term sheet exists in terms of annexation. I don't believe this is a decision-making meeting. I think it's to sort of get the pulse of, well, to update all the council on where annexation lies, to get a sense of where the term sheet is at, where agreements may have been reached, where there's still work to be done, and to get council's feedback and pulse of how they're seeing things at this update. I don't know, John, if I've that one correct.
Yeah, so the briefing book was in your materials, and that's that's the basis for drafting an agreement, which will get focused down on certain, it sort of refers to the key agreement points there. And so though that's when council will be taking under advisement the information they've received from boards at that point, and be giving some direction to staff on negotiating that annexation agreement.
Thanks, guys.
Will there be an update on the term sheet before April 20th?
Not that I'm aware of. There will certainly be information in that city council package for April 20th, but nothing's.
The version that we got was as old as October 2020. And I know staff has been working on that.
In taking delivery to create the study session packet, Karen, from Phil, there was not suggested there's an immediate revised version.
No. And I think that would be a good question for Phil at your March meeting.
Okay.
Dave, do you have any, yeah. We can't hear you, Dave.
That's probably good, but now you can't. So, thank you for that, Hal. Yeah, I'm a little perplexed, Dan and John, about the schedule, and I don't want this to be kind of a parochial perception, but it strikes me that, you know, the potential disposal discussion is put off well into the future after a lot of potential decisions get made. And I know that, you know, we've tried to, at least to this point, kind of divorce the annexation process from the flood mitigation process. But I guess I'm just a little concerned that we'll be well down the road that the disposal question and discussion will start to be rendered moot. And so I'm wondering if you can shed any further light on kind of the reason that that is later on in the whole process schedule.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. We were basing some of this scheduling based on I believe it might have been the 2018 motion that was adopted by the board about when they felt like they would be prepared to talk in detail about disposal. And from that indication, it seemed to point towards the 30% design. I know Kurt and I have personally talked about this a number of times over the past 2 years. So we've been trying to sort of not honor, but sort of adhere to that timeline that we are hearing from the, hey, without the details, how much property are you actually talking about is going to be needed for the flood wall project? How were they able to mitigate impacts? What is the groundwater risk as we see it now that the study is in? How is the land between the open space property boundary and the highway going to be utilized for the project? What are the feds saying about it in terms of mitigation requirements on their end? All those things, what we heard from past board motion was those are important details that this board wants to know before they really could entertain a direct disposal decision. And so that's why staff's been has put it after the 30% design, because we felt like that was the type of information the body was interested in knowing the details on. Is it 5 acres or is it 3? Is, out of that 3, how much is actually permanent versus just a temporary access easement? Those are pretty key issues. And so we've been trying to follow that guidance from what we heard in that motion. And I don't know, Kurt, I think you could chime in here because you and I personally talked a lot about timing for that. So
yeah, I think that's right. And maybe what we didn't perceive, going back a ways, was that there's 2 aspects to this. One is providing early input to what our interests are. And I think we've done that considerably in the previous motions to say, groundwater is important and therefore, et cetera, we need these things. And the land is important and therefore we really need this much of it for mitigation. That's sort of different from reaching a decision on disposal, which I think, Dan, you're absolutely right. We wouldn't want to entertain that final decision until we had a lot more hard information. But I don't think it precludes the sort of discussion we're having right now about refining statements of what our interests are that should be considered in these discussions. And Dave, I suspect one of the things you're focusing on is what decisions are going to get baked in pretty soon on the annexation, and how will that affect our options?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so Dan and John, I guess it would be helpful for us to get your sense of the relationship now between the annexation process and the flood mitigation process. And so that we, as a board, kind of get a better feel for, what that is currently and what that's going to look like in the future.
Well, and going back over the past motions from the past 2 years from this board, where staff is basically saying this is the guidance we have definitely received from this board, is the 119. Originally it was 82. It's now the full 119 based on the June 2020 motion recommendation that this body put forward. So what our staff is passing on to the negotiators that it's the 119 is critical for this. The water that goes along that would support restoration. So the water rights is a critical component that would often be an item that is negotiated during annexation. So the OSO and the water, as we see it, are the 2 main annexation ties. most of all the other elements we could tie back to the project, which would be our sort of quote unquote negotiations with the utility department or our demands of the utility department in the essence of a final disposal decision. And that has to do with mitigating direct impacts from the project, what type of restoration needs to be done in order to provide ample mitigation. If the 119 is not going to come forward to the city free of charge, then that would be the responsibility of the project, because I think a motion that this body had is that 119 would come up to us without OSBT funds being put forward. So those are sort of the main, what we see as the tie-in to the annexation term sheets that are being negotiated.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate this conversation, so thanks for that. The one, I guess, the basis of my discomfort is in looking at the term sheets in the briefing package. I was discomfited by the lack of specificity or commitment, I guess, by CU on a number of these points. And so my concern is that as the annexation proceeds, we're not going to, well, the question is whether we're going to actually get some agreement or closure on some of these issues that we've raised previously.
Dave, can I ask you to hold that thought? We do have a specific time slated for a real in-depth look at the term sheet.
Yep.
Caroline, or does anyone else have anything that's specifically timeline related?
I don't think it's for me right now.
Could I ask Dan and John, by what date do we need to have, to whom, additional items that need to be part of the annexation agreement?
If there are things other than have already been in your motions to date, that April 20th tentative date is the time by which additional feedback or recommendations might be timely, Karen.
So
And
at
Karen,
least-
if I might just
Go ahead.
add to that it also depends on what the item is. If it's an item that would demand a good deal of negotiation, then the sooner the better.
okay.
Negotiations are ongoing, and I think on that April 20th date, it's a chance for the negotiation team to sort of let them know the status and hopefully where that status is nearing some agreements in on all the issues. So if we're going to be introducing a brand new issue that has never been brought forward to either the city team or the CU team, sooner the better.
And I presume because of our role, those comments need to go to council and thereby from council to staff.
Yes, I would say that's probably would be in the form of a recommendation. You know, annexation is governed pretty specifically about, you know, who the players are for annexation in general, and who's got authority over what, because there is an OSO impact aspect to this particular annexation application, just like 311, in which we were asked to provide some feedback and input on the OSO there. That sort of obviously brings in a direct tie for this board to provide feedback. So if it's feedback or recommendation to the council, that's going to be just as good in terms of staff's going to see that.
Right.
The negotiating team will see that.
Okay.
Well, Caroline, I see your hand there.
Anyone can answer this. I just want to be clear. The recommendations that we are meeting to give regarding annexation, was that requested of us by any member of the annexation process, that they wanted that from us, or no? Like
No.
during this before April, have they, I know that we've given feedback regarding OSO and various things, but did anyone from the annexation process specifically want recommendations on that prior to April?
Yeah, and this would be a good conversation with Phil in the room because he's aware of all the governance around annexation. So for instance, right now under the Transportation Advisory, that board, they typically would not, in fact, it's in their
Right.
governance body that they would not be a body that would comment on annexation unless requested.
Like council. I remember that
and-
from the meeting, but I just
Right,
didn't. know
right.
With us.
So on that question, it's a little bit more ambiguous for this board. But because of the OSO aspect, it has traditionally brought in at least certainly at the staff level, a request of, hey, what do you think about this OSO? What interest does OSMP have on the OSO?
So they're more interested in that than our recommendations for disposal, or maybe not. No.
It's not my impression. So, I mean, my understanding of why we're here in this study session was a sense that March was a very important meeting because if we did have any business we felt was critical related to annexation, we're wise to have that discussed in March. And hence the sense of a pressing need to have this study session. So I'm actually hoping that this study session itself will answer that very question to some degree, if we do or do not have any interests in what is called the annexation.
Yep.
Is that fair? We are getting a little past the amount of time on timeline. I do have one question myself, Dan. In reading the location of second reading on annexation and then the disposal request location, has anyone said to you, or are you aware, would any annexation be contingent upon a successful disposal? I do think it's important to remember within the charter, there is the possibility of a referendum on disposal, which would take a meaningful amount more time. And so I'm wondering, is there a way, is there any possibility that there would be annexation without a flood project? Because in the way that it's set up, it seems to open that possibility.
Yeah, again, I think that would be better directly answered by Phil next month. My understanding, though, is that that any final annexation agreement, if it's agreed before the flood project is known to exist, that there would need to be some sort of tool to link the approval of the project to the annexation. To what degree and how that would work, I don't know, but Phil might be able to comment more specifically on that. But there's and that brings back a related point. As you know, there's 3 quote unquote landowners involved here, CDOT being one, CU being one. All of them could take action that would prevent the flood project from moving forward, which is another reason why, you know, a disposal decision, you know, we would want to make sure before we put ourselves through that discussion and we ask the community to have that type of final discussion, we would want to be pretty sure that it was needed, rather than going first, for instance, and then finding out that one of the other 2 landowners took action that made the whole thing mute and there wasn't a project and a disposal request wasn't even needed. That's sort of another reason why to have it a little bit lower in the schedule, is to make sure that indeed a request is going to be coming forward. It goes a little bit off script from what your question was, though, Hal. But my understanding is that an agreement that would be reached, there would be some tie-in and contingencies with the flood project being able to go forward.
Great, Karen?
And that goes to one last question on the timeline. I don't see anywhere approval from CDOT showing up on the timeline.
That would
Yeah, you're right. It's I don't. This timeline isn't capturing all the day-to-day work that's going on in the project. It's really trying to capture what I think the process subcommittee would be interested in is where are those meetings with the boards and the communities and the councils going to happen, and in what order. And yes, there's day-to-day work happening on a number of different issues.
But as you pointed out, there are 3 landowners.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it would be surprising to get an agreement with CDOT before the 30% design. That's just my guess.
Excellent point, Karen. At this point, I think we should maybe turn away from timeline. I'd like to introduce the discussion of the motions in summary quickly. I've done a little thinking about how maybe to structure this discussion. I think we agreed on a number of things. Number one is this board has made a number of substantive and material requests related to environmental mitigation, related to any potential disposal request. And I think that there's also been staff has done a good job of pointing out to me, and hopefully in your reading of this too, you'll see that there has been changes to those motions resulting from the project potentially moving from CDOT row into our property. Now, within that context, I think there's a lot of room to get into details and specifics of those. But for our purposes of this study session in the March meeting, I'm curious basically to ask various board members, what, if any, problems in these preceding motions that are material and serious might exist for them. If they think anything really substantive has been overlooked, to try and bring that forward as soon as possible. And last but not least, as we get into the next leg of the discussion, which is about the term sheet, for us to make a determination of what, if anything, related to the annexation process is important for us to discuss or might show up in any March action sort of related to that. So I guess rather than reading, going motion by motion, I wanted to sort of start it from the standpoint of, does anyone see any material problems along the way that should be, addressed sooner than later? And why don't we start again with you, Kurt?
No, and thank you, Hal. So I think one thing you're trying to point out is that the September 11th, 2019 motions were an updating based on the movement of the project. I don't know that they completely replace. I think there's some things probably stated in 2018 that were not changed for 2019, but I think it's a fair question. So no, I don't have anything that I would propose that needs to be added to this list, but I do think that the list Karen has put together is interesting because she's gone into more detail about, what sort of agreement would we need to underlie mitigation plan and monitoring and things like that, that I think are really worth considering. And because it's not specifically called out in the agenda, what are your thoughts, Hal and Karen, about when we might consider her list? It's at the very end of the packet.
I think that will be during, after we look at the granite documents, because that list really came about as through the research of the history of granite.
Okay, thanks. So we may, in some ways, revisit the question of motions and their sufficiency when we get to looking at the list that Karen's put together.
Yep.
Thank you.
If I were to describe some of the differences, Karen's list takes some general principles and tries to harden expectations around principles, which I think largely exist in the motions currently, which is a really important step of the process. but you know, and I guess Karen will talk about it. There may be some raising of some new principles, but it doesn't read to me necessarily like a lot of them. Is that
Thanks.
fair? Okay, does anybody else, you know, within the context of the previously existing motions, have any questions or concerns? Okay.
I will
Hearing
just
none,
say-
I have one. So Dave, I see you.
I'll just say that I echo Kurt's comments, and I think they're very well considered, and we should just move on. So,
Okay, I have one, and I think it's the right time to raise it before we look to review the term sheet. And that is that in our motion language, we discussed the appropriate time for a philosophical discussion of disposal being once the flood mitigation plans had been decided upon. It wasn't actually a request to wait until there was 30% completion. And I guess the reason why I think that that is interesting, and why I also think this study session is really important. And I actually went ahead and I wrote something about this because I wanted to say it just right. Basically, I think it's really important we look at this process through a realistic historical lens. The fact that there is some uncertainty among some trustees about the disposal meeting both the letter and the spirit of the charter is really an indicator that there's a decent likelihood or probability that there could be a citizens referendum. If trustees are doubting that they're fulfilling their duty under the charter, that will be something that citizens perceive. And basically, I think it will ultimately be borne by this board to attempt to convince the public that we've arrived at an agreement that fundamentally makes sense for the open space department, has a brighter vision of the future for this wetland area. And if we don't succeed in that, there's a pretty high likelihood that a referendum would come forward. Given that, I think that is where the question of do we have business within the annexation process itself becomes important. Because in the series of motions that we have made, while there has been, I think, a reasonable acknowledgement of the additional environmental damage that building this flood wall in open space habitat with endangered species causes, that it is largely the proposed mitigation of all of this is largely going to be potentially borne by the project costs itself. And that's not lost on the citizens at all, who ultimately, I guess one way of looking at it will be, due to their empowerment under the referendum clause, they will be the final principle in that negotiation. And that's why I think it's a good moment to talk about what, if any, business we do have in the annexation, because if we are going to try to put together a deal that can achieve this life and safety benefits and provide environmental mitigation, ultimately the community has to be convinced that it's fair. And so that's how I see these things tying together. Does anyone have want to riff on that? Kurt.
All I'm going to try to do is state what I think the process is related to a referendum and a disposal, mostly just to prompt someone to correct me. If the board votes against a disposal, I don't think there's any opportunity for a citizen referendum, but I don't know what recourse that gives council. It's my understanding that if the board voted for a disposal, then it could go to the citizens as a referendum. probably there'd have to be a petition process. And so who actually understands this process and would like to correct what I've said? Maybe John, maybe Dan.
Dan.
Well,
probably-
it's a two-body approval. So the board must approve by majority vote, three-person vote, to approve and recommend to city council a disposal of open space. Then city council has to affirmatively vote in favor of that. And then what that decision cannot be acted upon for a 60-day period. I think it's a 60-day period in which there is a petition period in which there's a threshold amount of signatures that have to be made by the electorate. If that threshold is met, then it does go on the ballot per se, and it would be up for a community vote. So I don't believe that third step has ever been put in place. Somebody who's listening may correct me, and please do. I'd love to know that. But for the most part, it's the two bodies approval, and then we do, no matter what, you wait for that 60 days, and then you can act on implementing that disposal. In this case, if Hal, if you're right, and we end up having all three act, that's sort of how it would work.
Yeah, I see your hand, Caroline.
So I think from what you said, the part that sticks out to me immediately is when we do or don't decide to enter into the process of annexation. And if that does lead to land mitigation, I think for me, the part that is very complex, that's going to require a lot of creative thinking, is that it's what we all know, is that the value of environmental goods and services goes largely unmeasured and leads to inaccurate accounting. It does not reflect the whole of our system and the values for the services provided by the species and those ecosystems. So trying to get to an understanding of the full economic value of the resources is the part that will, for me, be difficult when it comes down to numbers, unless numbers are doing something to try and account for what happens to our species and our ecosystems when we decide that they can go away. So just wanted to say that.
And that's the challenge with every disposal decision that this body and staff has had to work with. Quite a large one 3 years ago, and that was needed to support the Carter pipeline project. And so we've had challenging ones before. The granite one came about from one that was another tough decision to make of whether or not what the open space department is receiving in exchange for that is satisfactory to the board. I mean, that's where a hard decision for you all is at. And
yeah, I would like for other bodies that are invested in the project, and of course I might not get my way, but to show conservational awareness and understand what the ecosystem has and what it means for Boulder as a whole and what it means for us moving forward with climate change. Whether that happens or not, we'll see, but that's kind of where I stand with that. It has such an impact on future states of the system, for our next generations, what we decide now, especially on big projects like this. So as Open Space Board of Trustees and because of our charter, that's where we stand, with that.
In any case, my feeling is that if we can provide any helpful or beneficial advice to city council that would help enhance the probability that this process would survive this whole thing, that is beneficial and is helpful.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you. I think that for OSBT as a body, our recommendation is just that. And I think that as a whole, we look at the benefits, we look at the risks, and we make our recommendation based on what would be more beneficial for open space. And of course, that has a lot of moving parts to it, but that's that.
I mean, yeah, and my understanding too is that the results of a referendum, there isn't really another shot at that. Once that's a very serious thing to occur. And good for everyone to acknowledge that that is a very serious thing to occur. So in any case, I guess that's my view of how we should open up next the briefing book and the term sheet and share what we have heard and know about some of the points that we know are driving a sense of trouble that could jeopardize a holistic outcome for all the parties. Does that make sense? So I guess if everybody's feeling good about their understanding on the summary and the motions, why don't we turn our attention then to the term sheet? Luckily for us, even though it's a complex document, those items that touch directly on our business are somewhat limited. So I do think maybe it would be a good use of our time to go through those items one by one. How do people feel about that?
And there's a summary version. Is that what you're thinking of starting with on page 6?
So well, I was actually thinking on assuming everybody did their homework, there's a bookmark in the study packet that takes you directly to the term sheet, which is basically a dialogue between the city and CU. Is that,
Okay.
do people want to cover things higher in the briefing book? If so, that's wonderful.
Well, you have a summary of the topics and whether or not we're aligned with the parties on page 6. But you're right, there's a lot more detail down below the back and forth. And it's entirely up to you, Hal, where you want to start.
Okay.
I agree with you, Hal, that working through the term sheet would be best. I have one question on the front matter, though,
Okay,
if I could ask that.
please.
In the text and the diagrams in the first part of the briefing book,
Page.
well, several pages. I'm concerned about having solid numbers as opposed to changing numbers for the 119. I know that CU thinks that 80 acres is an important number. We have received documents that show that there are 10 acres under the levee. That's never mentioned in this document. So I'm wondering if between now and March 10th, staff can just solidify the number of acres in OSO and where those acres are. The number of acres under the levee, the number of acres east and south of the levee, and the number of acres west and north of the levee. And I don't think we need to go into a lot of detail about that tonight. If that's an assignment that staff can take on, we can deal with that on March 10th. Because there must be absolute numbers somewhere that could be reflected in the annexation agreement.
Got it.
Okay. So,
Hey, Hal,
yes,
I have a quick general question before we go into the detail.
Yep.
And that is throughout the key issues in the term material, there's CU keeps referencing the resolution of 6 key issues. And from my reading, there are actually 50 key issues in the term book. And so I'm going to ask staff, do we know what the CU reference to the 6 key issues is or are?
It's from a previous CU letter, but I don't think we've ever gotten that letter or the list of the 6.
So do we know what those 6 are?
Al, is that what I sent you? Is those I don't know if you had a chance.
I do not believe, no, that's different, I think.
It's just that, you know, in the response to some of the open space issues, it's like, well, this is dependent upon resolution of the 6 key issues, and I have no concept of what those are, so it's hard to say what that means.
I believe they're CU's 6 issues.
And I would argue our business tonight is to discuss what our own key issues are. And so as much as it would be nice to have better transparency, I also found the same problem of wondering what was being referred to, but I do think we can proceed without that.
Yeah, I agree. I just think it would be nice to know in our proceeding.
Okay. Well, barring those bubbling to the surface, do people agree that key issue 15, wetland and habitat mitigation for project direct impacts, seems to be the starting point in the term sheet that becomes highly interesting to us?
What page, Hal?
That's page 9 of the term sheet, or page 89 of the PDF.
I'll be glad to start there.
Great, Karen, do you want to start off on this one?
No, why don't you start? Because I have it clustered with several other things.
Okay.
I'm not sure where you want to start.
Basically, you know, as you read into this, it's a discussion about permitting and mitigation for the project's direct environmental impacts. You know, the CU has made a statement essentially that it is the responsibility of the city entirely to secure these wetland permits and mitigate. Staff's response came back and said yes, that seems to be it. Comments noted, and then the final response dated October 5th. Yeah, basically, I don't have any specific feeling that we have additional business here, but I wanted to find out if anybody else does. And that's the goal.
Oh, sorry, but what's the number of the key issue again?
15.
15, okay, thank you.
To me, number 15 pointed out the fact that part of the annexation agreement needs to clearly state that CU can mitigate their impacts on the PUB lands by doing mitigation, by doing and paying for mitigation in the OSO lands.
Hey, Karen, sorry to jump in. Do you have the PDF printout in front of you?
I have the hard copy, and it's on the bottom of page 9 of the term sheet and the top of page 10 of the term sheet.
Okay, I just feel like I'm not seeing 15, and I don't know why.
It's in the left-hand margin at the bottom of page 9.
I'm looking at page 9, but I'll figure it out. Thank you for letting me know.
This is on the microscopic print part of the packet.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Essentially my reading of this key issue is that obviously we as a board, and also because of regulatory requirements, will need to create new wetlands that are greater in extent than those that unfortunately will be displaced by concrete. Of course, that mitigation, we have decided through previous motions, needs to be abutting those threatened species, because we think that's the only likelihood that it could succeed. CU is also saying that it's possible that their own actions on the development part of the land could also require mitigation of their own, which they are hoping would be conducted also on OSO. I think that's interesting and something that's going to have to be resolved related to the board's request related to 119. And I guess also comes back, Karen, to your desire to just finally sharpen up the pencil on where the acres are, how much they are, and which ones reasonably can be turned into wetland again.
And as you point out, how we don't have any sense of how big that mitigation obligation will be on the part of the university, but you're identifying potentially some competition over the same mitigation area.
Yeah. So I would
And,
argue there's no direct business here, but it's good for this board to be aware of.
Mhm.
The other point to be aware of is that it's likelihood maybe decades before CU do anything out there that would require mitigation. So the interesting question would be is in that whole floodplain area, including the OSO, would there be any anticipated mitigation areas left, let's say in 2030 or 2040 or 2050, in which to do more on-site mitigation?
Yeah.
Or would the university want to reserve some part?
Oh, that's a good.
Hal, another concern I have is this is the first indication that CU sees the open space other designation as part of their possible development of recreational opportunities or solar fields, or they listed several potential uses of the OSO. And that kind of continues throughout the term sheet as far whenever the OSO issue is raised. And so I just want to make sure that we earmark that from my perspective, the OSO area is not suitable for any kind of ancillary activity other than restoration.
In the June 3rd, 2020 motion that this body passed, basically stated that, and that's been heavily conveyed to the negotiation staff.
And the guiding principles state, quote, "No habitable structures or academic buildings will be built on the property within the FEMA 500-year floodplain." So that also excludes uses of OSO.
But Dave is right that, yes, but Dave is right in terms of their definition of open space and our charter purposes definition of open space is different. And that is a very important nuance to this department. And making that clear in negotiations is one of the things that we are making clear.
Yeah, thanks. And Karen, just as a comment to that, I didn't find much comfort in that assertion because, again, this solar fields and recreation stuff is kind of always appears, and so there may not be building structures per se, but CU seems to think that there are other activities that are appropriate in that area.
I agree with that. And I'm very concerned about some of the wording that's used by CU and think that we ought to make clear what wording is acceptable to us as opposed to what's acceptable to CU. Because in my mind, there are significant differences.
So I would just respond by saying, I think any reference to any other activity for the OSO area is not something that we support.
Dan, just as a fact check, wasn't the OSO in total acreage reduced in the recent Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan update already?
Yes. I believe before the guiding principles, as John or Don, you may correct me, but I'm guessing 2016, 2017 is when we undertook a more detailed study of where the greatest environmental potential lied on the property, and that's how the 119 got to where it was. It was larger in scope prior to this Boulder Valley Comp Plan latest edition.
Yeah, That does, I mean, at least for those directly negotiating this, that feels like a relevant piece of history. Interesting, okay.
Another thing that goes along with what Dave and others have just mentioned is on page 12 under number 22, there's language that calls out features and appurtenances thereon, and that requires, that says it's subject to the approval of their regents. And I don't think we should allow anything in the annexation agreement to be subject to approval of the regents after council agrees on an annexation agreement. It's either agreed to or it's not.
Karen, are you taking some notes on these things for yourself there? That's an interesting point.
I am trying to.
Yep, okay.
And Karen, maybe you could just say a little bit more about what you're looking at and what language is particularly concerning. I think the rest of us are squinting and trying to follow along.
On page 12,
Yep.
where it says number 22.
Yep.
It's talking about conveyance of the land inside the levy. And it says it's not just conveyance of the land inside the levy, it's also, quote, features and appurtenances thereon.
Are you in one of the colored areas or not? What date goes with the text that you're reading?
I'm going to my micro print. Let me see if my eyes are still functioning enough.
Good luck.
At some point, we're going to start getting things horizontal instead of vertical so that the typeface can be a little bit longer. But so I'll ask staff to do that again next time, but didn't happen.
Karen, could I just jump in? Maybe I can help clarify. I think you're kind of combining both the staff response and the CU response.
The CU response in the second row says it's subject to, at the very end, subject to approval by the regents of the University of
Yes.
Colorado. And we can't as a city have an agreed upon annexation document that then can go back to the regents and say, oh, we don't agree with that. If the regents have something to say, they need to say it before it's an annexation agreement. Just like we have to say something before it's an annexation agreement. At the last line of the next item, which is staff's response February 2nd, it says, include features and material thereon, e.g. the existing CU levy, as real property appurtenances. So it's not only conveyance of the OSO land, but it also includes the features and material thereon.
And I think they call that out in several places, partly because they want us to pay for the levy material.
That's correct.
Right.
So I think that's a very interesting point, Karen. I feel like that's not maybe directly something this board would take action on, but I think very helpful observation for everybody who's following this project. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps you visualize something that would make sense for us.
Well, I think this brings up how where the levy is, the status of the levy is concerned, because if it's an important part of any mitigation or restoration effort, then its status is definitely material to the decision.
Yeah. Well, I guess with that, why don't we turn our attention to item 16? We were at 15, and that's the natural segue. For some time, this topic has been of interest to me personally. And I think one thing that feels very relevant to me on this is that there's actually two pieces of it that are important history. And so give me a moment to offer a brief retrospective. There were two important moments where CU made active decisions that were somewhat non-environmental. And those included during the original acquisition of the property. The acquisition was approved by the CCHE, the Colorado, is it Commission of Higher Education? And it was required in that approval that an EIS, an environmental impact study under NEPA, would be conducted. That study was never conducted. And it's unfortunate because that study, when this berm was reinforced, there was significant long-term ecosystem value lost. And the study that would have described what was lost was not conducted. And yet here we are faced with, yes, we are going to have impacts on 5 new acres related to this dam construction, but we're also going to be doing a very large amount of new wetland creation and mitigation to try and regain the environmental value that's there. And it just strikes me as difficult that the moment when the ecosystem value was lost didn't have a study, and yet it's likely that the city will be saddled with pretty significant expense of doing a study to explain how we're going to try and put that ecosystem value back. So that's one, I think, very important thing to consider about how costs over the history of this decision making were sort of laid out. The other piece that feels very important to me is that City Council, Boulder City Council, on multiple occasions advised the university against reinforcing and adding permanence to the levee itself on both the basis of environmental reasons and because they predicted it could interfere with future flood mitigation. Now, CU, despite the advice of the city, just proceeded with a significant reinforcement, which led to a lot of the dryness and dewatering that will now have to be considered for mitigation, et cetera. And so I guess from my standpoint, I find it surprising their posturing on the costs related to this, because for me, it's a somewhat cut and dry, clean up your own mess problem, combined with the fact of you are advised not to do it all along the way. We said this is going to interfere with these projects. Lo and behold, it is. And now there's a desire to not be accountable for that decision making. If there was one point here where I thought we had business in the annexation, this would be the one that feels that way to me. What are other people's thoughts?
And Hal, is one of your concerns is that because of their previous actions, the project is going to be a lot more expensive, and there's a potential that cost may be pushed onto OSMP that might be more expensive. Is that sort of the way you're connecting it to our interests?
Well, at least onto the city.
Well, ultimately, yeah, it could be us potentially, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's my understanding any EIS would be a project cost, and it's all project cost. But this is the difficult part, Kurt, that comes back to the rub of the referendum and our duties to the charter. It kind of matters how we perceive it and how council perceive it, but ultimately it's really important how the citizens perceive it. You know what I mean? Because due to our charter, they are the final principle here. So anyway, I understand that's convoluted. I get why people think that these things should be kept separate. I just feel like that belief is unrealistic compared to what I hear so consistently from members of the public.
Yeah, I agree, Hal, and I think that's why, I asked staff for if there was an estimate for the berm removal or berm, status, because I do think it's an important cost that's going to have to be underwritten by some entity, and especially as it relates to potential mitigation of environmental impacts. And so For me, the other thing is whether in fact CU was in violation of the Mineland Reclamation Permit that Flatirons Gravel had initially as far as the berm was concerned. And so all of that kind of conspires to put the responsibility for taking care of the berm not on the city, but onto CU.
That's an interesting point, because had that original plan been followed, there'd be 5 bodies of water out there presently.
Right. Right.
So is there agreement on the board that the responsibility to take care of the berm should be CU's?
If I was going to make a statement from the board, I think it would be a concern, and Hal's, I think, laid this out pretty well, that actions the university has taken are going to have an effect on the total project cost, which, because we always have limited resources, may reduce resources available for mitigation, and potentially might even impose costs on OSMP that would not have been imposed if those actions hadn't been taken. Again, I'm just trying to state it in terms of our interest rather than saying we think the city shouldn't agree to this and this,
Yeah.
if they're not very specific to our interests. So that's all I'm trying to do.
I also wonder, Kurt, without telling anyone what they should do, we could just comment that perceptions of ecosystem cost transference have the possibility to derail this plan.
Yeah, that's a pretty good
Even
statement.
almost just leave it there.
Yeah, I like that approach, Hal.
Anyway, it's an idea.
Hal, if I could just, the way staff have been looking at the levy as an asset, not a liability. And that's why we've made the case that it should be treated as an appurtenance to the land. We haven't, as Dave mentioned, we have not done the mitigation planning yet, so we don't know how that fill might come into play there. But to truck in substantial material to do the restoration could be an additional cost if CU were to remove that berm ahead of the project.
Have you guys been able to do any sort of measuring to know if that berm could be used? How much could be used?
We suspect that a good portion of it could be used, Caroline, yeah, but we have not done any geophysical assessments of it.
Okay, because I've thought that as well. I mean, it's there, and there's also a hole, and that would require less trucks. But you know, I don't have any background to know if that truly would work, where you guys are saying that would work.
So what I found very interesting, John, in the term material is that CU asserts that it should be the recipient of the material if the berm is in fact removed. So I think,
Yep.
you know, there's certainly a negotiating situation there. And I think the board certainly doesn't necessarily think that that's a suitable use of the berm material unless it's determined it's a suitable use.
Yeah, and that was sort of our take of your prior direction was to acquire the 119 with everything on it and use that to our best possibility for mitigation. So not letting CU remove the material ahead of the annexation, or as part of the agreement. So that, I think we're on the same page with that, but I'm not 100%.
John, is in the 30% moment, will there be significant clarity about what's going on with that feature?
Yeah, we will have, at the 30% design, we should have a good sense of what the mitigation will look like at that point, Hal, and we'll know whether we'll need all or some of that material. for whatever we would be able to get done under the project.
Another opportunity to have a more discussion on this would be in the June timeframe, in which we're going to be talking more specifically about environmental mitigation, as Don would probably have more of an opportunity to look a little bit more specifically. And so that could be another opportunity for us to talk in more specifics about it.
But the annexation agreement will be negotiated by that time.
Correct. So if we've got it wrong, that how we're proceeding with negotiation is the 119 and the berm is part of the 119 comes over and gets conveyed to the city. And so if we've got that wrong, yes, knowing about that now would be super helpful. But we're assuming, since we do believe that the berm is going to be an important aspect of restoration, that it's beneficial for the berm to remain as part of the land.
Will you paint that picture? I think that's what's confusing people. No one's painted any picture of how this riprap berm is going to become part of a beautiful wetland.
So,
Well, and as you're doing that, can you help me out by talking about elevations and difference in surface height, topography?
so as Dan mentioned, this was the type of concept that we wanted to bring forward to the board in June, when we have a little bit more sense of how we're going to do that. Right now, even to have it's really going to be more the 30% design when we're going to know exactly what earth moving is going to be helpful for wetlands creation and general restoration throughout the OSO. But essentially, we need to make sure that the hydrology works there. And so in order to do that, it may mean raising up the elevations in some areas and taking it down in others.
Karen, I imagine there's also some more study to be done on what the characteristics are of the berm. I think some of the material may be quite useful for the embankment dam, whereas other parts of it may be more useful to us. And that sorting needs to be based on a lot of core sampling and things like that, which I don't think have been done yet.
No, and that's a good point, Kurt. There could well be very important uses of some of that berm material for the project itself, not the mitigation.
Kurt, may I ask you a question? Do you know from your experience if, we just put a notice out to the city and said, whoever wants the berm can come take it? Who would know how much the elements within the berm could be valued at? Do you know who would be good to decide that?
Well, yeah, I mean, well, first of all, the thing that we're trying to avoid, Caroline, is the city having to go out and purchase material and truck it to the site. So if there is a reservoir of material on site that we can use to reduce the cost of the overall project, that's what we want to do first of all. Then I suppose if there was some of that left over, then the city could surplus it, put it out to bid, and determine the highest bid for the remaining material that wasn't necessary. But that would depend a lot on the buyer's distance. It's all in the trucking. The cost of material is all in the trucking.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure within the various layers of it and the different sampling that would need to be done, how much of it would actually be useful versus some expert that would be able to say half of it wouldn't be appropriate for what we were thinking.
Yeah, and that's really what will be determined through the preliminary design, and we should know better around the 30% towards the end of the year.
Okay, so you feel like that element will be in the 30%?
Most likely. I'd have to confirm that with the project manager, but
John, I've got that question down as one of the things that we'll go back and get some clarification on.
Thank you.
Well, and the problem that I see with everything that's been said just now is that that's too late. And some kind of wording will have been agreed to with CU months before that.
I'm not following why it would be too late, Karen.
Because council has a second reading on annexation agreement on August 24th. And the 30% design is only going to be finished in October and made public in November. So all the micro wording establishes who's going to pay who. That will be approved August 24th. And
can that shift? Once it's at the 30% portion, that is a contract, if you will, or once that is put out there as now we're at a point to review. I thought that the 30% was at a point to review, and it could possibly, I mean, obviously you would kind of want it to stay what it was, but it could shift left or right. You understand that to be different?
Well, there's the 30% design for the flood mitigation project, and then there's the annexation agreement. So we will see.
But they're not totally separate. There are commitments about the levy material and what happens to it, who pays for it in the document.
Yeah.
So the question regarding the annexation and the materials is if we want CU to take the materials off-site as part of annexation, that is a reversal of what we are currently understanding our negotiation position. So for us to flip-flop that, we would have to come to two conclusions. One is this material is no good for restoration, and two, it's no good for the project design flood mitigation project as well. If we add up A plus B, that would equal, boy, this berm's a liability. I think that's the concern I'm hearing from the trustees, is that if it can't be used for restoration, or if it's not going to be used for the project, then we're sitting with a liability for the expense of needing to get rid of it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, Dan, I think it goes back to our in-person tours of the property when a beautiful picture was created about how this acreage was going to be re-watered and ultimately returned to wetland and habitat that Prebbles and Euphrates Trust could eventually re-inhabit. And that vision included the thing gone. It didn't include where it was going to be, nor was there a case made that riprap that was brought in from some external source would be used to recreate a natural environment. So I guess there is just a little natural confusion. It seems like you guys are further ahead than the board on this.
Well, I think what Don was communicating to you as part of that is part of that mitigation. It actually requires, filling things up because it actually, those ponds hold too much water for the type of environment we're looking to create out there. And so far it's been a very reactive situation where if there's fill material available, we'll take it in order to help raise some of those wetland levels to have more seasonal ponding than lakes, if you will. And so yes, we do view the opportunity to have material right there as another opportunity to create those water bodies we're looking for. Don, I see your microphone's off. I don't know if you want to chime in at this point, but.
Yeah, just real briefly, typically you don't know final grades of a mitigation site until 50–60% design, because after that, presumably you've done a fair amount of groundwater monitoring. So, generally the elevations you want to establish that will create those wetland conditions. So after that, you'll know whether you need to import fill or you'll need to remove fill. But like Dan said, there are some open bodies of water out there that could accept some fill to create those more wet meadow conditions rather than kind of abandoned gravel pits. But again, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that whether we need the fill material from the levee for the final mitigation to be successful won't be determined until the mitigation plan is fairly well developed. But having said that, fill is pretty valuable. And so whether we need it for the mitigation or whether utilities needs it for the flood project, that's determined. And then, I think what Caroline was asking about what the material is, what the levees are actually composed of. Obviously, we know that there's riprap on the face, which isn't, a negative thing. You can, if you need to raise the elevation of an area to meet some mitigation requirement, that can be accomplished by using, riprap like exists on the face of the levee. But what the levee is composed of, what type of material was used to build that, can be determined just with geotechnical analysis, doing some borings. And I believe that some borings were done at the berm when the initial geotech project was done by RJH. So there might be information there, but it would require a lot of supplemental information to determine, just exactly what that levee material consists of.
Yeah, I think it would be good to do some type of soil sampling and really understanding like the chemistry within the soil and if it is going to grow things or if it won't. And I would assume that part wouldn't be that difficult. Like if you were boring down and taking dirt from each level, that we could then sample each level and ensure that, nitrogen existed in it.
Yeah, and that's a pretty standard process, not necessarily the chemical makeup of the soil. It's pH and, nutrient components, but certainly the size of the material, whether it's kind of sandy, silty, clay, all the different kind of mineral components, that's a pretty standard process to determine that, just with general boring of the material and having an engineer log the boring, and he or she can say, 0 to 30 inches is this material, 30 to 90 inches is this material. And you do that enough across the surface and you have a pretty good idea what's under there.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't expect it to come back as, a high value, I wouldn't call it soil, but, I don't expect that. But to know what it could, if we needed it to offset the environmental impacts of things being brought in from other places and the dump trucks and things like that, obviously that would make sense.
I think John mentioned, trucking is a big cost. So the farther you move it, obviously, the more it costs. And, moving it around on site, you can do with earth moving equipment. But once you start importing or exporting it off site or onto the site, that's when you have to take the material, put it in trucks, haul it somewhere, dump it, move it, and it gets pretty expensive.
Right, but if it had no value to us, then of course we wouldn't want it to be our financial problem as well.
Exactly. Yep.
So Hal, I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of what I think is the real key issue here, and that is the cost of mitigation and who actually underwrites that. And my concern is that in the briefing book materials, it looks like the city is accepting the entire cost of mitigation of the project impacts. And I'm going back to what you initially said, is that if actions were taken by CU that in fact make the mitigation costs higher for the city, then in fact, it's my belief that CU ought to underwrite correcting those costs for the impacts that they caused. And so I'm okay with all of the discussion of the berm status, but I'm very concerned that the overall mitigation costs aren't really appreciated by either the project proponents or the public, and they are going to be substantial. And if the city agrees to underwrite all of them, I think that that will be an extremely high cost.
Okay, I think having heard all that, what seems really clear is that for both the staff and this board, we have progress we need to make clarifying how this stuff does not represent ecosystem transference, and to convince the public that that has all been thought through. Because the perception is out there right now that there is a transference of ecosystem cost, and essentially the berm is a tool by which CU tried to extend its development potential on this property, and the city would now be coming to clean that up. How that occurs, I don't know. It's a very complex project, but I'm glad we got to talk about what those perceptions are and how we're going to have to make a good case about the fact that this actually does benefit us. Okay. Should we talk next, perhaps, the other thing that's really struck me as important here is a discussion of water rights. So in my reading of the current status of that situation is that understandably CU is doing research about the value of the water rights. We know it's impossible to create wetland without reintroducing water. And basically, I mean, I guess we can start with just asking you, John or Dan, do we have a very clear view of exactly how much water is going to be needed, and basically saying it's a deal breaker not to have the water to mitigate with?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a deal breaker not to have the water. Again, looking at that as kind of a pertinence to the land, because it's important not only to do the restoration, but also to be able to manage the property on into the future. So the request that staff has been making is to have the water rights associated with the property transfer with the 119 acres. And that was our understanding of what the board had instructed us to be asking for.
Okay, and so it just feels stalled, but you feel strong that our needs are being communicated with the gravitas required.
Yep.
Yes.
Kurt?
Quite often.
Quite often. Do we have any sense of what the university is doing with those water rights right now? Are they leasing them to other people? And if we acquired all of them, where would that water not go? Do we have a sense of that?
This is difficult stuff to talk about, but
well, if you can't, that's okay. I was just curious.
So I understand that CU has done some irrigation on the property. Whether they've drawn all of their use all the time, I don't know that. But we know there are approximately 30 shares of Dry Creek Ditch number 2 associated with the property, and all of the 119 acres is within the service area of that ditch. And so that hence our interest, and that all that water right could be used on the 119 or in other areas that ditch services.
Okay, thanks, John.
Yep.
And can it be used on, for instance, the PUB area?
I believe all, there may be a small amount of the PUB that's not in the ditch service area because you can't get the water there. But I believe some of the PUB is in the ditch service area. Yep. And hence they do have an interest potentially for irrigation of recreation fields or other things. to use that, but
Right.
yep.
Okay.
And Hal, this is number 24, key issue, right?
This
Just in
one
case
is
people
number
are trying to
24.
follow along.
It's page 13, number 20. Yes, 4.
Okay, page 12 and 13.
Yep.
And I'm sorry, John, I know you said it was uncomfortable, but I just want to make sure that I either did or didn't hear you right. Were you saying that because they own it, so we don't know, that there is a possibility that they have used up their water? Is that what I heard you say, or did I not hear that right?
Yeah, Caroline, we're not sure what the use by CU of those water rights has been over time. And that could get into questions of the validity of the rights. So, but we're not aware of what their history has been.
Okay, so that is not like public information that,
Yeah, I see it does note, Caroline, that the university has a consultant reviewing those rights.
okay, I read that as well. I just wanted to double check. Thank you.
And I think what you said, John, is that to mitigate and manage the 119 acres, all 30 shares would be needed. Is that correct?
No, that wasn't exactly what I meant. I believe we could use all of those 30 shares on the service area for the ditch, which includes the 119 as well as other properties that we own.
Off-site.
Potentially. We will want to do this restoration looking at all of our adjacent property and how the water is managed throughout the area, really running from the Fancher property all the way up to Van Vliet North. So, and Don might have other perspectives on that to add.
Well, but you're not saying past South Boulder Road.
I don't know.
I believe the service area ends at about South Boulder Road.
Okay.
John, one other thing that I would be interested to know as you're working on the conveyance of groundwater, whether or not this discussion of water rights either enhances the possibility of that working or not. So I'll just be interesting to know when you get to presenting that, if this is two distinct issues or actually together.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And basically the wetlands that we have in the state natural area are all driven by irrigation, Hal. So.
And I think that's really important. I think having that water opens up the possibilities and the options for doing different types of mitigation. As you know, the wetlands and the Spiranthes habitat and the tall grass, they're all supported by a combination of groundwater and surface irrigation. So if we're expecting to replicate or restore those types of habitats on the OSO, irrigation water would be key to having successful mitigation.
So just digging into that deeper, are there upstream risks on these water rights that could undermine the success of mitigating for these endangered species?
Upstream risks of
like for example, the seniority of this right. Is it possible that our work to mitigate for these threatened species could be ended or undermined by an unknown party that is not being discussed?
Well, the priority of the water rights wouldn't change necessarily. We wouldn't. My knowledge of water law is about this, but I don't think we would have to go to water court for any type of change case or any, go for any adjudication, because we're not changing, we wouldn't be changing the service area, and we wouldn't be changing the use necessarily. It would still be agricultural use. So we wouldn't fall out of priority. We wouldn't have a junior water right as a result of taking ownership from CU and then using the water on site or in the service area to mitigate for the environmental impact.
Okay. Unless I see anybody else, maybe we'll just leave it at an understanding that there can be no mitigation of these threatened species without water. Another topic here that caught my eye is the discussion of lands outside the levee. And I'm curious, within the context of what we call high hazard zone, do those lands have any real economic value to any developer?
Can you tell us where you are in the term sheet?
Yeah,
Hal?
let me find the number, forgive me. This is about south and east of the levee, point number. Boy, it's easy to get lost in this document, forgive me.
That's the point.
East and 21.
21.
Hal, are you talking about the area outside the levee that's in the 100-year floodplain?
Yeah, the pre-existing wetland, that's hard to differentiate from existing actual acquired open space out there.
Yeah, so you're asking the value of that to?
It basically, in short, to be direct, it's presented as like this amazing gift over and over again in the term sheet. And my point is, isn't it a high hazard floodway that has no value to any developer? And perhaps isn't as amazing and valuable as a gift as it's referred to so consistently? Won't it basically remain wetland no matter what?
Yeah. Yes, it would. I mean, ideally, it would be part of our comprehensive floodplain restoration project. And so some of those wetlands there, I'm sure Don will want to look at whether we can enhance them. So they may actually be slight liability because it will take some restoration, but we kind of know about the whole OSO property. It's all going to take some work. But yeah, so I would not say that, that it's extremely valuable area either from a, certainly not from a development standpoint. And it's in a great landscape position for future restoration and future benefits to conservation. But right now it's going to take some work.
And does some of that land have existing Ute Ladies Trust and Prebbles in it now?
Some of the OSO does have Ute Ladies Trusses on it, is our understanding.
Been told.
With respect to Prebbles, I'm not aware of any trapping to confirm any Prebbles on the 119.
I guess my point in asking the question is just this. Is there any ongoing requirement of private landowners that requires investment for them to manage or steward lands that has that kind of character? Is it beneficial to CU to have OSMP doing that, meeting whatever regulatory requirements might exist?
No, I don't think so.
If you own it, it's kind of, you can't harm it, but you're not required to report on it or.
Correct.
Okay.
But Hal, I think your point, if I understand, is that whoever does the appraisal on that property outside of the levee shouldn't be coming back with a really high number because it's within the 100-year floodplain. It can't be developed. So that should be bounding what the appraised value is, I would think. Is that sort of where you were going?
Yeah, and then combined with John's point that in order for it to reach its highest potential for us, it may actually take additional cash investment.
Right.
Okay. Those are the ones that I sort of highlighted that seem to have, nexus to the open space department. Did I miss anything? Is there any
Yeah,
other?
I have a bunch of others.
Okay. All right, Karen, lead us away.
On the briefing book, page 32 and 36. When they talk about view shed, they make a big deal about the trees will make it not possible to see buildings or what else? It's on 32.
So this is prior to the term sheet. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, where the pictures are. And I'll go to the term sheet in a minute because there are two sets of term sheet items related to this, but for context, I want you to see the pictures.
This is on page 36 of the briefing book itself.
32.
Right.
At the bottom of the page, it says looking east, but it's really looking west.
Yes.
There's several major errors where they say east and they really mean west because they don't know what direction they're looking. But it says proposed elevated access road, future South Loop Drive. And you can see the ramp, which represents the road there. And then on page 36, at the top of the page, you can see the height ceiling for buildings. And then the arrow on the right side says, see you south behind the trees. Okay, so I'm talking about both the elevated access road and the height of the structures themselves. And my question is, I believe just based on the trees that are in the square cattail ponds at the south, I believe that at least some, perhaps a majority of those trees are crack willow. And if we were going to do restoration on that site, we might get into some heavy elimination of crack willow. And so I think we need language in the annexation agreement that says CU must landscape to screen the elevated road and the buildings, and therefore preserve the view shed to the west from the South Boulder Creek Trail.
Why don't you repeat that for the public again? It's good to hear that one twice.
I would propose that we ask for language to be added to the annexation agreement that requires CU to landscape both the elevated road and the buildings, those parts of the site, in a way that will preserve the view shed from South Boulder Creek Trail to the west. Because if we start taking out crack willow, there's not going to be what is shown on these photographs on page 32 and 36. There's going to be the view shed to the west with the flat irons and a lovely elevated road that traffic is going back and forth and buildings that CU has built. Unless they're required to landscape the site in a way that screens those built elements so that when one is standing or hiking on the South Boulder Creek Trail, you see trees like native trees I would require, cottonwoods, for instance, that would normally grow in that kind of area from the open space users.
And to be clear, Karen, the trees that you're referring to in this picture are probably right along Dry Creek Ditch number 2 and the levee, not the South Boulder Creek where we've been removing crack willow pretty actively, but you think a lot of these.
But if you look at the trees that are growing in the square cattail ponds, they're crack willow based.
Okay.
Best I
Some
can.
are Russian olive.
Yeah. And I think if we're in the process of doing a restoration to reconnect habitat, we're not going to leave a bunch of Russian olive and crack willow, are we?
Well, that strikes me as a really interesting point. Kurt, I mean, for our March meeting, that is business in the annexation and is new information. How do we leave this appropriately?
Well, I think we're going to come out of this meeting with a list of items that we're concerned about. And that's, in my mind, one of them.
So Karen, just to follow your thought there, I think what you're suggesting is that ideally, if the university develops the area above the 500-year floodplain, that they would landscape the area to the east of those buildings to screen them as much as possible. Is that sort of what you're thinking?
That's right.
It would still be, above the 100-year floodplain, because that would be into the OSO, but to screen those buildings.
And to screen the elevated road. Because part of the value of open space is that it's a natural area.
Right.
Not a human built area.
The elevated road is on the existing, what is it, public? It's obviously way outside of the OSO, but you're concerned that
Neither of these areas are OSO. They're areas where
Right.
there will be built structures
Right.
that will be visible from the South Boulder Creek Trail and therefore impact the OSMP State Natural Area viewshed.
Yeah, I think what Karen's saying, Kurt, is that the view shed that's being touted in the briefing report is actually will be in the restoration area and will presumably disappear or be eliminated as part of that restoration. So you can't really assign a value to a view shed that will no longer be there.
Correct. And so that takes me to term sheet page 16.
Term sheet.
Get out your magnifying glasses.
Yeah.
Page 16, issue 32, which is all about view sheds. And if you read that first row under the word view sheds, you can see what I'm talking about.
And I'm sorry, do you have the number of the issue also?
32, key issue 32.
Got it. Thank you very much. Got it. View sheds.
Read the first row under the word view sheds.
Right.
In my opinion, that needs to be revised.
I'm having trouble. State specifically what you're saying. Sorry, Karen.
You want some suggested language?
Or just, I'm actually just having trouble understanding what you're pointing at. I'm looking at section 32. Are you talking about the city's policies or council direction or CU's statement or the staff response?
Well, near the bottom of that, of the item 32, key issue 32, it talks about that CU agrees to the ceiling concept of buildings no higher than blah, blah, blah. But that's not going to solve the problem. The view shed is destroyed if in the restoration process, we remove crack willows and Russian olives. And so there needs to be compensation from on the CU site to screen those built structures from the view that you get from the South Boulder Creek Trail. Otherwise, the value of the view shed from the open space and mountain park state natural area trail is decreased.
And so at a minimum, Karen, I think you're saying the analysis of the view shed and the impacts on the view shed is based on screening by trees that may be invasive and may need to be removed. And without those trees there, what they're saying here about it won't be visible may no longer be the case.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, the language here, it seems to be more building height related. And I think that.
But the topic is view shed.
Right. What we're trying to introduce is the fact that there are some natural issues associated with view sheds as well as the height of buildings.
Yeah, I think when we're discussing it, they say, this is under our guiding principles, and they talk about different approaches. But if everyone working on the annexation could agree to the goal of an ecosystem-based approach to manage those natural resources and maintain the biological diversity, it recognizes the value of protecting an array of those biological communities within the larger landscape context. So if in the guiding principles for those specific points, if everyone, anyone is listening, and they like the idea of an ecosystem-based approach, that might drive consensus.
Yeah, but this is strictly about protecting views and contributing positively to the character of the city's gateway. It's specifically about view sheds, not ecological functions or biological communities. It's just about view sheds.
I would still argue that would be an ecosystem-based approach to managing this type of thing. I mean, you could argue it either way, but I was trying to suggest something that might perhaps lead to consensus.
Yeah, it's not that I disagree with you. It's that it's that the point in the term sheet has to do with view sheds.
As they say here, and this is the CU statement on February 2nd, it says preliminary view shed analysis of the mountain backdrop demonstrates that buildings up to 110 feet will not impede the views of the mountain backdrop, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what we're doing is we're just suggesting that that analysis may be based on an assumption that all the trees that are there today will stay there, even if we go through restoration of the levee area.
Well, this sounds like a really important note and really good analysis, Karen. It takes a community member with really excellent detailed observation skills, because that will have a big impact, and it's between the lines.
Yeah. Once we get the restoration done, I haven't gone out there and mapped every tree, But my assumption is once the restoration is done, everybody from the turnpike to the South Boulder Creek Trail will be able to see the mass of CU South buildings.
Very interesting point.
Yeah, I hope we'll find CU amenable to that. I've been kind of waiting to.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that CU is not going to be amenable to. That's clear by reading the term sheet.
But I guess on this particular point, and I sometimes, you know, related to the history that sometimes seems relevant to the community at least. I've been waiting for a moment to recount an important piece of history, which was when NCAR originally developed at their location. CU's Natural Area Committee was leading the charge that ultimately resulted in NCAR only developing 10% out of 500 acres in that location on the hill. And that was very related to their desire to maintain a view shed to the mountains, impacting other people's projects, putting forward their environmental knowledge, convincing the National Science Foundation, as well as the director of NCAR, Walter Roberts, that the right approach was to preserve 90% of that parcel. And it was interesting too, because ultimately a waiver in the blue line, not too dissimilar to the possibility of referendum on this project, was required to do that. And Boulderites saw that it was a good deal, and they voted 79 to 21 to approve that resolution. And I think there's I mean, I know that's high level, but there's a lot in there because it suggests Boulderites do know what a good deal looks like for the environment. And more importantly, CU knows what a good environmental solution is on other people's projects, which kind of ties your point to Caroline's, which is I still have a secret hope that at some point during the actual annexation discussion, CU will bring some of their own environmental knowledge and skills to the table, so this feels less adversarial and more partnership based. Anyway, off my high horse there.
No, that's a good point. I think that those high levels of discussion are the way to drive consensus, because when you get down to these point frames, that's where, you know, things get stuck. But if we can look at the larger context of what we're doing, I think that is a better means of moving forward.
Interesting history.
Karen, you said you had 2 points.
Well, let me go on as long as we're on page 16 of the term sheet.
Okay.
Lighting is mentioned several times. And there's a clear statement from the city staff at the bottom of the box that stated February 2nd, 2019 about outdoor lighting.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe outdoor lighting is another one of those things that could affect the OSMP state natural area land in a significant way, and would advocate for including the wording about outdoor lighting in the annexation agreement.
I see that CU's response is that view sheds will be negotiated after the 6 key issues have been resolved.
Right. Oh, we're not too worried about this. Let's move on. And I think it's an important value of OSMP state natural area lands.
Well, I think you make a good point that today, if you were out there in the dusk, there wouldn't be a lot of light coming from that area. And so that's the present condition. It's a good point.
And there are city outdoor lighting standards, and there's also a black light code. Mm-hmm. And I think all of those things need to be built into the annexation agreement so that we don't end up with a chunk of state natural area that's well lighted.
I think this is all going to be really helpful to be on the table. and talked about early as they decide what this agreement looks like or does not look like.
My next chunk of comments have to do with what are called the rec fields. And they're either 30 acres worth or 18 acres worth, depending on whether you look at the term sheet on page 2, 5, 7, or 9. Because they're mentioned repeatedly, the rec fields. And there are several issues about the rec fields that I'd like to see if the board is concerned about.
Which key issue do you want us to start at?
Well, let's try page 2 of the term sheet.
Yeah, I also am noticing it at page 12, key issue 23, restoration and other uses allowed in OSO.
Yes, and page 18, number 37.
Okay, well, you
It just-
wanted us to start with number what? What key issue number?
On page 2, at the bottom of the page, it says the 30 acres to be used for recreation fields.
Okay,
And
so this
then-
is under initial zoning.
Yep, and I'm not so
Okay.
concerned about the zoning. I'm just concerned about how many acres we're talking about.
Yep.
On page number 5, under the February 2nd statement, again, it's subject to regent approval. I don't know how we can have regent approval if things are nailed down in an annexation agreement.
My guess, and I'm not an expert on this, is that the university won't bring to a final discussion anything that has not been reviewed by the regents. I mean, both the city's going to have all its reviews and the university will have to have all of its reviews because otherwise, you're right, the regents could undercut a final agreement.
Yeah, and I somewhere somebody's got to answer that question and make it clear. But again, the last sentence in the first paragraph under February 2nd, it says if the recreation fields are not able to be accommodated within the flood mitigation project footprint, that's up by the Highway 36 Table Mesa interchange, the university will retain the right to an easement to allow sufficient access and use of recreation fields in an area that is mutually agreed upon. And then on page 7 and 8, it says, and if the area is not in the PKUO, then it needs to be in OSO with ingress and egress and concessions and storage and restrooms and all sorts of other appurtenances. And in the maps on the stuff at the beginning of the briefing book, it shows these rec fields in 2 different places. So I don't know where they're going to be. I'm reluctant. I mean, I think there are enough statements in here that say they can't be in the 119 acres, but CU keeps bringing up in their statements, oh yeah, they can be in the 119 acres. So at some place in the annexation agreement, it needs to clearly say where they are.
Well, my feeling, at least from what I've heard from most of these board members, is the OSO is going to be due to the lost lives of threatened species. It's not going to be about playing football, playing soccer, playing rugby. I feel like that's built into the core request on 119. Is that fair, John?
And the board all agrees with that. Well, then we better request wording in the annexation agreement that makes that perfectly clear, as opposed to the statements about, well, we'll put it in the 119 acres because it may not go elsewhere.
My reading of this is that that's an area that there has not been agreement reached on.
Yeah,
So,
but it's clearly an area that we all feel strongly about, is the way I'm reading this.
yeah.
Okay, here's another component of that. I have to think that Don and John would cringe if on the PUB land, we had runoff going to the east into the 119 acres. And the term sheet on page 23, number 49, get out your magnifying glass.
Yeah.
Page 23, number 49.
Stormwater.
Yep. Says this will be addressed prior to commencement of construction. But I have to think that we have an interest in this, and that in the annexation agreement, we have to somehow put down a stake in the ground and say runoff from CU's developable land will not go into the 119 acres. And my question is yes or no?
Yeah, I think that's critically important.
I would assume, Karen, and I'd love to hear what staff think, that if we own the 119 acres, it's CU's responsibility to ensure that there's no new development that creates new stormwater runoff on our property. I think that's a city provision, but I don't know that for certain.
Yeah, I think I think the understanding here is, or what's being negotiated is compliance with all of the city's stormwater requirements. And my understanding, Kurt, would be that that would be the case. They couldn't overload our property. They need to address stormwater management on their property.
Yeah.
It seems like that issue should be addressed during some stage of development review. Prior to commencement of construction, that's a pretty broad window. There's a lot that happens before construction. I think it should be during the development review process, whatever step normally is taken to address kind of stormwater and drainage issues ought to happen then.
I agree. I think it's too late.
Is there an example that anyone in this meeting knows of when they say in the second box, still in 49, subject to building permit application and works regularly and in good faith with the city on water discharge? Does anyone know to what they're speaking of?
My reading is that the university, being a state level body, has some special authorities that allow it to avoid some permitting. Hence Karen's concern about why the annexation agreement include language so that we don't have any surprises on water quality.
I just wasn't sure if anyone could verify that they do work regularly and in good faith and have a good relationship with the city in that respect.
people have repeatedly mentioned that the annexation agreement is the only time that the city can require things of CU. If it's not written in the annexation agreement, the city will not have a leg to stand on.
I just wanted to know a little bit more about the veracity of that statement.
I think it's a really valid concern, Karen. I mean, as I research the history of the property, there's enough instances where things that were written down were not followed, that it's a very legitimate concern to paper this appropriately.
And my reading of this section is that the city is proposing that the university will have a stormwater plan, and that will be part of the review process.
Very helpful to be highlighted. I guess as we go through this, we do see there is business that is in the annexation that's fundamental to our goals for these species, plants, and mitigation.
The next
I
item.
think Dave's talking, but he's muted.
Thank you. If I could just add on real quickly to what Karen's been talking about. Actually, CU has identified 3 uses, potential uses of the OSO property, and I think we ought to make sure that we identify those in whatever statement we make. And those are, in addition to recreation fields, solar arrays and community gardens. So those 3 activities CU is proposing for that 30 or 35 acre section of the OSO 119 acres. And I don't know, I just lost the reference to that I had, but anyway, it's referred to several times in the term.
Yep. I agree. Another concern that I have with these rec fields, and both this and the lighting are based on the fact that I live near the Fairview High School recreation fields. And I know what's happened with those recreation fields over the years, and they've had lighting added, and they've had amplification sound systems added. And pretty soon they're a pretty invasive component of the neighborhood.
They add bleachers.
Yep. And so my question is preserving the sound shed as well as the view shed something that we care about on open space lands? Is it okay to have an amplified sound system next door to open space state natural areas?
Really good question.
Feels like that relates to your points on stormwater, where I'm sure the university is not bound by the city of Boulder's municipal sound standards.
One question I have, and it's tangentially related to our interests, is these have been described as recreation fields. I'm curious if the city has ascertained that the university does not have plans to have competition at these fields. We're not going to move the soccer team NCAA competitions or lacrosse competitions to these fields and then need the stands and the concessions and all the things go with it. My guess has always been that this is just recreation fields and it's not a place they would hold inter-university competitions.
Yeah, I feel like the way that most universities do design these things, asphalt could very well be a part of it, as well as parking. I've never.
They have specifically said they're planning for parking,
Yep.
ingress and egress, maintenance vehicles, concession stands, restrooms, storage.
Yep.
So they're planning on appurtenances with the rec fields.
Mhm.
And that's a question in my mind, Karen. I'd be interested to see more about what the university is proposing. I think some of what you described has been associated by the university with the tennis courts, with the cross-country competitions there, things like that. It would be interesting if the university plans to add competitions beyond tennis and cross-country in this area.
Kurt,
You know, long ago, we agreed, the city and the university, they wouldn't put a football stadium there. But are they going to hold competitions beyond what are currently held in that area in the future?
My sense, Kurt, is that they may not be doing intercollegiate competitions, but intramural activities will definitely be part of that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dave. I think that's probably more what they intend, but I would love to have some clarity in the annexation agreement about if there's intended to be future NCAA competitions beyond cross-country.
This feels like,
Here at the Fairview High Field, there are track meets that are Boulder High, Fairview High,
Right.
with a full-blown sound system all day long that plays rock music and announces, now we're ready for team number 5. Team number 5, come to the finish line. And it goes on all day long. Do we want that in a state natural area
Or adjacent to it, yeah.
or adjacent to it?
I think it's a fair question.
in my opinion, this comes back to Dan and John's point about the understanding of what open space means to the charter, which is non-human development, certainly no appurtenances and other, concrete, et cetera. I think the sound is interesting. Maybe we would focus in on that, but it feels like in that discussion, we could find ourselves a long way from our open space piece. So my personal feeling is that if we're going down that path, to focus in on what's important, which seems to be the sound related piece. Combined with the understanding that open space means non-developed.
I'm sorry, Hal means non-what?
Non-developed.
Non-developed, yeah.
I mean, for them, a soccer field is open space.
Mhm.
And that's a different view.
Yep.
All right, Karen, I think those are all really good ideas. Do you have anything further in the term sheet?
Yeah. On page 6, number 9.
Groundwater monitoring?
Oh, yeah, that's okay. They're allowing the city to go on their property for additional groundwater monitoring, and I think that's okay.
Karen, in the interest, unless you've got more material business, in the interest of time, we're about 23 minutes past where we hope we'd be. And I know we've got this granite thing ahead, which we need your insight on. Are we getting near the end of the term sheet, or do you have some more material stuff there?
No, I'm near the end. We've talked about the wetlands impact.
And Hal, while Karen's reviewing her notes, might I suggest when we're done with this, we have a 5-minute recess before we get into granite and the additional thoughts that Karen's put together.
That sounds great.
On the term sheet, page 14, number 27, key issue 27.
Multimodal access.
Yep. Repeatedly refers to a trail linked to South Boulder Creek Trail in coordination with OSMP. And that is diametrically opposed to the city's wording. And it's not, I mean, I believe the way I read number 27 is that this has not been resolved. And I think OSBT needs to take a stand on this item, reiterating what city staff, and I presume this is John and Dan, have already said, which is it's not up to city CU coordination, as CU puts it. And this is a direct quote from number 27. Any roads or trails on land conveyed to the city, including any potential connectors to adjacent city open space, will either be designated by the city and become part of the city's open space system or abandoned by restoring the underlying land at the city's expense. And then it goes on to say that this is all at the city's sole discretion. And I believe that OSBT needs to say, this has to be resolved in the annexation agreement before it is brought to council.
What would you say that resolution looks like?
That language needs to be in the annexation agreement, and that CU's comment that the city's comments are not relevant to a multimodal system are totally irrelevant. And that OSBT supports the city staff comments that I just read. Because I think they're critical to underscoring, and they are part of the guiding principles. The guiding principles say trails connecting to open space trails would follow a typical city public process. And it's totally at the city's sole discretion. It has nothing to do with CU city coordination. And from the first public process meeting 3-4 years ago that CU held at East Campus, CU has been publishing maps with trails going from CU across the state natural area over to South Boulder Creek Trail. And we must take a stand on this in the annexation agreement, I believe. It is too important.
So do we really think that the university is saying that we, the university, will determine where the trails go outside of their property?
I believe they're saying, trust us, we're good negotiators and we'll coordinate with OSMP, because they keep using the land, coordinating with OSMP, in coordination with OSMP, and it is not a matter of coordination.
Okay.
This is, my recommendation on this, Karen, would be, it seems like we have a number of points that are going to return in March at our meeting. And those are going to take the point of bullets. I think we have to get some specific actionable language for the board to review at that time. I think it's an interesting one. I think that could be I see some complexity in that one where you may not have everybody's exact support on it. We'll need to feel that out, but let's put that on the list that is presented and cross that bridge at that time.
I feel like it is important because we are not to allow the use of open space lands for the financial benefit of private convenience of the individual residents or private businesses or corporate landowners. And as Karen states, if maps are being put out and students are in the process of deciding what university to go to, they realize that their university, they can just from school have these trails that lead out to open space. It creates a lot of impacts in maintenance areas for us while providing them profit. And I don't see any language where they're willing to take responsibility for that. But whether they are or not, either way, it's a private convenience and a financial benefit.
The counter argument to that would be when a private landowner is going to create gifts of land that they previously owned fee simple, that they have a somewhat legitimate claim to recreation access to the system.
But it seems like they're already showing that when they don't. Is that correct when I'm saying that, Karen, or no? From what you,
you know, what has been done, I'm not sure. I just this is one where I understand where some of my co-board members are going to be, and maybe I'll be in the minority, but when I think of beautiful campuses that are integrated with nature, for example, the Breadloaf campus at Middlebury in Vermont, part and parcel to that is to be able to access and experience those lands. We cannot credibly ask CU to do a beautiful job of integrating their new campus or whatever with these lands, while at the same time saying we're going to try and remove your ability to. It's just non-practical.
But there is a process for establishing trails.
but I agree with what Hal said, and I think that he uses a perfect example, and that campus may or may not, but probably uses, again, for the term that I enjoyed tonight, an ecosystem-based approach where it's not just something that is benefiting them. There are other things that we need to come to terms with that, you know, may not give them a direct benefit, but for the whole of the entire system of their students enjoying what it's like to live in Boulder, of the maintenance and preservation of open space, of the city and its residents. It's a give and take. It's not just take.
I just feel like we'll need to debate some specific language on that one, you know? There's a lot packed in that discussion.
Karen, I certainly agree that this would have to go through a process the city and open space would agree to. I mean, CU is not going to dictate where trails on our lands go. We're also not going to tell them where trails on their lands can go. So it's the intersections that are going to have to be done through mutual agreement. And I'm still trying to figure out if this says anything different than that. I agree. It's worth stating clearly that this has to be an agreement between open space and the other city departments and the university.
Okay, with knowing we'll return to that, are we ready to move into Granite or a break and then Granite, or?
May I just ask John and Dan, is there a joint wetlands delineation study that's been completed since it will be done before the first reading of the annexation agreement? Do you know anything about a joint wetlands delineation study?
Study, yeah, there was when we did the guiding principles, there was a study of the wetlands. That may be what it's referring to.
It says it will be done prior to the first reading of the annexation ordinance. So I don't think it's the Brown map.
Then
Sorry,
I'm not.
page were you on?
It's referred to on page 17 of the term sheet.
17. Yeah, I guess that, Yeah, I can get information and update you about that in March.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
Okay, I'm
Okay.
ready for a break.
Yeah, great. With that, why don't we take a break for 5 minutes to come back at 8:38? Thank you, everybody.
Good.
Okay, it looks like, yeah, oh, there's Caroline. Great.
Kurt, I heard your comment about not enough time to do the driveway, and one of my neighbors knows that I'm busy with my nurse practitioner program, and I just peeked outside, and my driveway is nice and clear. Every time it snows, they keep not saying anything and just doing it for me right now. So when I leave to drive to Denver in the morning, as they're so nice, it's so
Are
unbelievable.
you lucky kid?
Yeah.
I know.
Can we all get in that program?
Yeah. I'm
Sign
gonna,
up here.
I'm gonna keep this neighbor for myself.
Okay, everybody. Given time constraints, etc., I want to try my best to tee this up. And Karen, I'm going to hand it over to you after I do that. So tell me where I'm wrong, but let me take a shot at this.
Sure.
The reason we've included the documents related to the granite disposal in this study session is because it shows you what the actual specific legal requirements were on these deals, and points ultimately to the fact that this board will have to come to some sort of resolution about what the final terms that would have to be met in order for there to be an executable transference of property or disposal. And so we thought it would be good to inventory these things first, so there aren't many surprises. We know what's traditionally been done. And so what we can actually do is really look at the top 5 documents. It's the meeting packets and memos from 2 specific meetings, as well as the actual granite contract itself. And basically fast forward to the final page in this document, which Karen has kindly produced, that basically takes what those requirements were, begins to suggest what they contain and entail. And so in the interest of time, that's sort of the big picture of how those top documents reference down to the bulleted list, which is called SBC mitigation and disposal conditions. Initial draft of ideas. We're very much initial draft, and it's not about any decisions being made, but more an inventory of what's been done in the past, what's been required, and what did that look like. So Karen, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, because I do visual things better than words. I'm going to suggest that people go back in their packet to the OSMP Board of Trustees agenda item for the meeting date July 10th, which is a 1/4 inch down in the packet.
I like that reference.
If you, and by the way, the meeting date July 10th, 2013 is on the back side of a sheet of paper, not on the front side. But if you go from that to page 7, you can see a colored picture of the widening of 36, which is what provoked this. And the red highlights on the sides of Highway 36 show the expansion area. And to compensate OSMP for the land that was disposed of to allow that expansion, the next page, page 9, shows the granite and opal properties, which were acquired for mitigation for the taking of the red highlighted parts on the sides of Highway 36. Any questions about that?
I thought this was very interesting. I was surprised looking at attachment B, which has the red marked areas, that some of the land we disposed is pretty darn close to where the flood wall is going to go for variant 1. I just thought that was interesting. I had forgotten that.
Yeah. And the reason why I went into the bowels of OSMP documents to get this is because there's been a total turnover of senior staff since this happened. And obviously a total turnover of the board. And I thought it would be instructive for everybody to see what happened and the sequence of events and the legal documents required to carry that out. So the first document that you have is the contract between CDOT, which is the party that wanted the open space land for the expansion of Highway 36. And as a contract, it's a legal document that in the end was signed by the mayor and includes everything from, as well as being signed by the governor and the city manager, and contains all sorts of maps and contractual attachments. And as Hal said, I'm not going to go through that tonight. And then next in this packet is the Open Space Board of Trustees packets for March 13th, as well as the minutes for the March 13th meeting and the actions that the board took. The packet for the July 10th, 2013 meeting, and the minutes showing the actions that the Open Space Board took at that time. And I'm just going to point out one of the things that was really a surprise to me. There are some, 20 pages worth of exhibits right before the minutes of the board meeting. That are attachments that talk about every inch of temporary easement that the project would use and the survey delineation of those areas that were used for construction, and as well as the parts that were disposed of, and all the legal descriptions of every square inch of land that's involved. So unless there are questions, I don't have anything else. I mean, as Hal said, I found it instructive to go through and read those documents. I hope at least some of you have read through them and have a clearer picture of what this entails.
So Karen, I'm looking at what Hal described as the SBC mitigation and disposal conditions. Is this list of ideas for disposal conditions?
May I stop you for a minute?
Yes.
Before you go on to that page, does anyone have any questions about any of the Opal and Granite property documents?
Seeing no questions, we're just happy that you pulled that together for us, Karen. Thank you.
Was there anything in it, Karen, that you found that could have been done better? Like when you looked at the document, was there anything that jumped out at you now that it's this far into the future that could have been done differently?
No. And I think the detail of all the documents is what was most
Yeah,
important to me.
yeah, I know that that is the
And the clear time that it took.
right, right.
You know, when you look at the time horizon for each of these, it's months and months and months, if not years.
It feels to me, Karen, like the big takeaway here for me is that such big decisions are not done nebulously. They're done with very specific legal language, which is driven by the board, which states requirements that are mandatory to be met.
Mhm.
Karen, I want to put that question to you a different way, though. I think what you're saying is that all of these documents and details really have to be worked out. But from a higher level, do we think the granite restoration was successful? Yeah, so that's kind of a big deal. I mean, we had a lot of detail, but the basic idea of the restoration to mitigate for those disposed lands, at least there's some question about its success, and certainly Don and others could chime in, but it's something we have to think about.
That's right.
Would they be willing to chime in and give their input for someone new to town to understand the history a little better?
Don, are you still with us?
I think he is.
Of course I do.
Aha, there he is.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, we felt like the design and the construction of the mitigation for pebbles and orchid impacts was really well done. We had a lot of input on that. You know, we had a lot of information on the existing hydrology of the granite site, and I used some innovative techniques to transplant sod in areas that contain orchids. I won't say that we actually, you know, dug up orchids and moved them, but they were, you know, in that general area. And we thought that, again, the plan was really well laid out, and unfortunately, in the years that we've monitored, while we see some of the associated species that typically occur with Euclid's Trusses orchid, we just haven't found any orchids growing there. You know, having said that, you know, they're kind of a tricky plant to propagate. There haven't really been any intentional methods, I will say, of doing that where that's been successful, but you know, time will tell. We're continuing to monitor. Scott has, I believe they've completed their last monitoring report, but we're gonna continue to keep an eye on it, both for you know, the success of Preble's habitat creation, but also Euclid's Trusses orchid. So, but you know, bottom line, yeah, you know, the intent was to recreate habitat for orchids, which, you know, technically was done, but there haven't been any that have shown up there since the project was completed.
And I'm just curious from, and of course I could be wrong, from my understanding, it was like 8x4 pieces of land that were just like moved. But if there was more, because I heard you say that you guys were doing some new techniques, or it was innovative in the way that you were doing that relocation.
Yeah, yeah, it was. And I would say that, you know, I think the hydrology, which is really key, was matched real well. You know, it's not unlike, you know, sodding your lawn. Basically, you take live plants and you put them down and you water them. There's, you know, in this case, water, you know, from subsurface groundwater. But, you know, I think that, you know, more or less everything was done right. They did a really good job of weed control. They did a good job of, you know, of seeding and planting. And I think that, you know, the general composition of the vegetation turned out really well. The one missing component, and of course a key component, was the orchid itself. So.
And if you say that this is their last year for doing the monitoring, we all know that they can go years and years between blooms. Was the project designed in that time frame due to financial constraints as opposed to like a longer time frame, or is there a way that we're still going to continue to monitor that specific area where the transplant was done?
Yeah, so the regulatory requirements required a certain number of years of monitoring, and so that was completed, and the Fish and Wildlife Service signed off on that. We will continue to monitor that site. I would say informally, we won't use the same rigorous methods they did, but there's the possibility that we'll include some prebbles trapping out there in the future. But certainly, it's not a huge effort to visit the site during the late summer when spiranthes typically bloom, and walk around the areas, because the areas that we transplanted the sod are marked and well known. So it's not like it'll take days to do any to determine whether the orchids are blooming there, but it will take some effort year after year to just go out there and kind of check to see if we see anything blooming. We're also part of the I guess the habitat requirements for orchids include some level of disturbance. And in the South Boulder Creek floodplain, we've relied on grazing mostly for that disturbance. If you allow the associated vegetation to grow up and crowd out spiranthes, they really don't do well. So one of the provisions was to use grazing prescriptively to create that disturbance that the orchids typically need to grow. So we'll be looking into that. We want to make sure that's compatible with the maintaining prebbles habitat, maintaining wetlands, but it's also a way to manage undesirable weeds and also manage that stature, that the height of the vegetation necessary for spiranthes.
And in a completely natural habitat, would that natural disturbance be the floodwater?
Exactly. A combination of, first and foremost, flooding and the disturbance associated with flooding, but also, grazing ungulates. In the past, it wasn't cows, it was elk and bison and other, big wild animals, but, and also fire to a certain extent. So, there's disturbance in
Dave, I see you
floodplains.
smiling. Thank you.
So Don, how much was the per acre cost for the restoration on Granite?
I don't know off the top of my head.
So do you think it's comparable to what we would expect on the CU South, on the OSO 119 acres?
It would probably be require mitigation on the CU property would probably require more money. The grading that we had to do on Granite was pretty minimal.
Yeah.
Was creating some contours. We hauled, I can't remember how many cubic yards we hauled off site, but it wasn't a lot. And compared to the earthwork that we anticipate being necessary on the CU property, it would probably be more expensive to do Euclides Trusses orchid mitigation and just wetland mitigation in general on the CU property.
Off the top of my head, I'm thinking $100,000 to $130,000 per acre. Is that something that you think is reasonable?
Sean's going up.
Well, but Dave, are you
Oh,
talking
Granite.
about the Granite property, or are you talking?
No, the Granite property.
And John, are you disagreeing about Granite, or are you talking about CU?
I think we were correct me if I'm wrong, Don, but I think we were estimating more closer to 200,000 an acre for the kind of earth moving that will be necessary to restore the CU property.
Thank you, John.
think
That was
that's-
my
Yep.
point. So,
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I took Dave's question as, is if we added up all the receipts for granite, what would it cost per acre to do the mitigation there? And we can find that out certainly. But you're right, John. We were looking at, we use comps for granite and for Colorado open lands, the wetland mitigation that was done there, and other restoration projects we've done on Boulder Creek just to get an average per acre cost. And, it was up a couple $100,000 per acre.
And did you have water rights for those projects?
We did not rely on directly applied irrigation water on the granite property. Having said that, all of the properties surrounding granite are flood irrigated. So, every time you turn a ditch on, the adjacent property, the groundwater comes up on granite. So, which is pretty typical in those alluvial soils.
what I found interesting as a takeaway from the granite contract are two things. One is that the ratio of affected or disposed land to what was mitigated was a 3-to-1. It looks like about a 3-to-1 ratio of mitigation to impact. And the other thing, so that was interesting. I think given the quality of the wetlands that we're anticipating are going to be disturbed, that we as the board might think of a higher ratio is more suitable. But the other thing that I found very interesting is in the granite contract, we're looking at a prairie community restoration component as well. And so when we say wetlands mitigation, I think in a lot of people's minds, that's, a very particular kind of notion, what that means. And in the granite property, as I think a lot of us are trying to say, that the associated plant communities that are associated with wetlands are equally important. The wet meadows, tallgrass prairie, etc. And so in the granite property, there was over 6 acres of associated plant communities that were also part of the mitigation package. And so I think as we look at what's appropriate for mitigation on CU South, on CU South, but as far as the flood mitigation project, that there's some basis for us attributing value to those associated plant communities.
And Don, you seeded for all those native grasses, right?
On granite?
Yeah.
It was a combination of that sod transplant, seeding, and planting, basically, pot nursery stock.
Okay.
A lot of shrubs went in out there.
Don, would you mind just coming, because I think timing, the length of time that was referenced, and could you give the board a sense of when these contracts were actually put in place and the timing of the overall project from when we first learned of the disposal request and we entered in the disposal request, and when was the timing of these actual detailed contracts put in relative to the whole project?
John and I and Mark Gershman were digging back through the granite files last couple of days. And John, did you kind of stitch together a timeline for that?
So it was a really complicated project, and it it involved several layers of mitigation, which some of which won't even apply in the present case. But essentially the detail and everything that's in that contract that you see there, that was kind of worked out over a long period of time and really couldn't be completed until, at least the 90% design stage of the project, because didn't even have the area surveyed that where the footprint was going to be. So, it was, it's quite an interesting involved process. And, like this one, it takes a considerable amount of time and increasing levels of certainty around what the project is before you can finalize your plans.
John, I just want to make sure I understand what you just said. Were you saying that the disposal by the Open Space Board didn't happen until the 90% design?
After that, I mean, it was really
After.
The contract didn't happen until 90%, right?
Yeah. The project started in about 2005 or slightly before that. It wasn't until the 30% stage, probably until 2011 or 2012, something like that. And then it was 2013 that things got finalized and they were able to do that. That's when they made the request for the disposal, and all of the work that had been going on for years and years got packaged into a final disposal document, and also an agreement with CDOT.
That's interesting.
The natural question for me there is, given this project's scope and magnitude, it seems like where this discussion and piece of the study is going is perhaps to an interim step that doesn't qualify as a legal contract, but which takes more of the shape of a resolution to provide clarity to all the actors of what the basic, right now we have a list of the motions which does not communicate clearly what would be or will be required. So an interim step that's not fully a contract, but something of much more clarity and specificity about these are the deal-breaking items.
Yeah, and Hal, the reason why I think that's important is when I sit in on process committee meetings or engage in discussions with residents who want to know what's going to happen next, or engage in conversations with council members about the timeline, I don't think there's understanding, I'm going to say broad brush, anywhere in the community about the complexity and the level of detail and the amount of work that's needed to get from this idea that there's going to be a flood project and mitigation to getting down to a contractual agreement and board votes. And I think it's really important to have a way to convey the substance of that process to the entire community. Because, the Fraser Meadows folks think that this is, you decide on flood mitigation and you build the dam and it's over. And there's a lot of steps, and the engineers have repeatedly and cautiously, appropriately, said, it's going to take a bit more than that. But I think the detail of the whole thing is important to sketch out so that everybody in the community has a better understanding of what would be next.
Perhaps also to make clear that there's limits to what the trust me element is.
Yep.
And making a clear statement about that. I mean, I note you make notes about escrowed funds, different small requirements that do need lead time and significant planning. These are not insignificant amounts of money. Where, how are they being temporarily funded before their permanent long-term funding through various city apparatus?
Go ahead.
I see where you're leading with this project, and I think it's an interim step the board has to consider.
And the other things that Don presaged in his comments just now are the kind of monitoring and determination of what's success.
Kurt, I saw your hand.
Well, I'm just trying to sort of summarize what I'm hearing. Karen, I think one of the main things you're saying is that we need to provide additional clarity about some of our interests in the project and in mitigation, much like you've done here on this page you put together, so that can be communicated as early as possible, but that we also need to convey to the public and anyone else that if the Granite property and the CDOT enlargement is any model for us, the finalization of the disposal may not occur until we've got a 90% design. And so we're really trying to address two different poles of this process. One is get the rest of our needs and interests to the decision makers as soon as we can, but also help people understand what we learned from the Granite process. I have to admit, I'd been wondering, well, how far along was CDOT before we did the disposal? But I was even surprised to hear John say 90% level. I don't think that's the sort of thing that's being, I don't think that's the expectation in the public's mind or maybe in council's mind right now. So it's really good that you've walked through all this detail. I know it was fun.
No. And the other thing is that it appears it's going to be a long way from the annexation agreement to this. And that's why I'm pretty adamant about the detail that needs to be built into the annexation agreement, because if it's not nailed down there, it's going to be probably after CU starts building that anything else comes down the pike.
Yeah.
And this might be more for Kurt as the chair to say than me, but whatever members of the public that are listening, if there are any components from CU that are listening, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are here to serve open space and to serve the public here in Boulder. And I think what everyone is saying is the public would benefit from more clarity. So if there is anyone listening that would like to do that, any representative from CU, I feel like it would be fair. I'm speaking for everyone, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, to say that we would always be open to any discussion that would help clarify, move things along, drive consensus with this project. So,
yeah.
Kurt, I don't know. Again, I don't know if that's kind of speaking for you. Sorry about that if it is, but
no, I think you're speaking for yourself, and I think you probably have a lot of agreement on the board. I'll let Hal moderate.
Yeah, I'm sort of wrestling with all this. I mean, I see, going back to our prior meeting, the more that takes place on the project and the more various checklists come down, the less scope for having an honest discussion of whether such a disposal actually meets our charter requirements is actually likely to happen. And when you hear Don talk about somewhat mixed results in previous mitigation for these species, you got to really balance off a couple ideas of, well, I can see net benefit for open space in a well-constructed agreement on this, but that could come at the cost of significant lives of threatened species, which are unlikely to be recovered. That's really the interesting part of this topic.
Yeah.
So I guess I would ask Don, do you recall along the way in the Granite process, when and how did that happen there? Or was everyone believing that the purposes for that disposal were were well conceived from the beginning?
Yeah, I think we were pretty confident that the plans that we worked on with CDOT and their consultants, were well conceived and well designed. Or I guess in hindsight, staff wouldn't have recommended disposal of open space and that very critical and valuable habitat. So we were confident that we had a pretty good chance of successful mitigation. Again, we couldn't really think of anything that, that wasn't kind of well thought out or maybe didn't go well. A lot of times, during construction, there's miscommunication and, somebody digs up the wrong piece of sod or something like that, but puts it in the wrong place. But it was pretty well orchestrated. So, and again, I don't think we would have recommended to the board at that time that we go, move through with disposal if we weren't confident that we had a good plan to mitigate for those impacts.
Yeah, and it isn't, I don't think in that project, or at least my understanding of it wasn't just, I mean, the mitigation was important, but for, a 9-acre disposal and 5 acres of construction easements, the city got a 24-acre property, a significant restoration on that property, and then an additional 22 acres of mitigation on the Colorado open lands property. So, you add up those numbers and, you have an area, the Granite property had been a long-term goal of the city to acquire that and fill in protected areas along South Boulder Creek. And, that was a $1.3 million benefit to the city that CDOT paid for. So there was a lot of, and that's going to be forever protected now. And I think there's a lot of benefit to that, and we have time to hopefully get even Spranthes to come back in that area.
Kurt?
I've always assumed, or at least based on what staff have told us about Granite and other places, that the mitigation package that staff puts together as the proposal for mitigation for this project may incorporate quite a lot of what we might call out-of-kind mitigation, rather than a plan that says every square foot of Spiranthes that we eliminate, we're going to recreate it somewhere. But I'd be interested to hear what Don has to say. I mean, I think it's going to be a mixture of in-kind, but with a lot of out-of-kind, but valuable restoration. What would you say, Don? And you're muted.
Yeah, I think that's becoming more and more apparent when we do mitigation, is that it's kind of the whole package, the big picture. It's not, we're going to mitigate for 1.63 acres at X to 1 mitigation ratio. And, it's not all about the numbers, the acreage. And years ago when we were doing, working with CDOT on the wetland mitigation for the US-36 project on the Colorado open lands property, that was when the Corps started shifting to this ecosystem-based approach to mitigation and looking at ecosystem services rather than just acre per acre mitigation. And that was a little confusing for folks at first, because when you kind of live in that mitigation ratio world for so long, and then the regulatory agencies starts talking in more kind of flowery or less quantitative terms, then, it was a learning curve for everybody. But, in hindsight, and, even moving forward, it is a good approach, because then you get, you get the core mitigation habitat, but then you get the enhancements that go along with that, or the buffers that, I think, like Dave mentioned, on the Granite property, there was, I think it was it 12 acres of Preble's habitat and almost 2 acres of Spiranthes habitat, but then there was 6 acres of this upland native grassland buffer habitat that was created. So it really met those ecosystem services goals, where you're looking at the whole picture rather than just, the individual parts.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add that an unknown at the time that ended up being a benefit is that because we brought Opal and Granite into the fold, that allowed the acquisition of Coleman and Suits to follow, because those are now connected. We probably wouldn't have pursued those if there was going to be that hole between our connectivity to the east. So sort of a side benefit of, we were able to continue that acquisition of nearly now the whole floodplain running to the west.
I feel
Now,
like
if you could only get people to stop building in the floodplain.
just the small, I think, and difficult counterpoint there is that from the perspective of threatened species, no matter how beautiful of an engineered vision we have for a repaired landscape using our best human knowledge, let's not diminish the fact that existing natural life gets lost. And that's the really uncomfortable thing about this whole project, because it seems like life and safety for human beings gets served, development rights get served, all these people loom really large at the table, and yet this piece, which we as the open space board are supposed to look after, which is the unique and rare species, ends up totally underserved. And that's what you confront reading the charter. It's not really on us to be thinking about life and safety and development as much as these other interests.
Yep.
So Karen, did you want to walk us through your document? What were your plans, you and Hal, for this?
Well, I think it would be useful to know whether people perceive these items as important considerations.
Can I interject on that? I think, to preempt, I think there's a lot of important considerations. I feel like what would be helpful is if we decide that some sort of an interim document that's more authoritative makes sense for us to basically demonstrate with more clarity where this is going earlier in the timeline. I mean, was that not sort of where we're hoping to kind of head?
Yeah,
I agree.
my opinion is that would be useful.
Yeah, I think the clarity needs to be had. My hope is that if CU is listening, they would like to engage in some sort of conversation that allows us to give, good, concise clarity. But if not, I think that your choice of words is accurate in that what we would produce would need to have some really hard lines in order to communicate, because it's kind of just a one-way discussion right now.
And looking at this, I think that there's a lot of this is speaking to the utility department. And so what would be those aspects that would be speaking to annexation and more to the CU city conversation? And then there's a lot of elements that are speaking directly to the project, which is speaking to another city department and less to CU. So there's that consideration too, of two separate documents at this point, one that's informing the annexation conversation and then one that's sort of more concentrated on the flood mitigation project, or are you looking to combine it all, or?
Well,
You know,
my personal opinion is that OSBT is responsible for making recommendations to council. We're not, our job is not to make recommendations to CU or to staff in other departments, or, so I think the document has to be addressed to CU and then used by other parties as part of the process.
You mean
you said
address-
CU, I think you mean council, addressed to council.
I mean council, yes, thank you.
That is a good point, Karen.
So I see some value though in what Dan is raising here. It might be helpful just to keep the forest visible for all the trees or vice versa, to produce something really soon, like at the March meeting, that specifically addresses annexation and says, hey, we've got 3 years of motions here. We're going to continue to add to those. Karen's listed some things that may need to be added to the project motions. But for right now, we're going to highlight, in case it's not clear, things that we think need to be considered in the annexation. And some of those we've already got in motion. Some of them, Karen, you've identified things like lighting and noise and the view shed and things like that, that maybe need to be put on the table sooner. Is that what you're thinking, Dan, to sort of feed it out when it's most needed?
Well, I was, yeah, that's one approach of what I was saying, but I think regardless, communicating out which ones may be the annexation topics. And I know you all are thinking it's all blended, and I understand that, but I think from communicating out from the first order of business that council's next going to see an annexation update, how to communicate that out from a whole list of things that are, and the rest of this is assuming that CDOT's on board, that annexation happens and that the flood project continues. And then there's all these other elements that have to do more with a future disposal situation. And I know they're intertwined. It's Kurt, and I think what you were saying is in line with what I was saying, but I think there's other ways to go at that.
Okay, thanks.
Caroline.
I think this question would be directed towards you, Hal, or at least I'll throw it at you and see who you throw it at. If we are discussing mitigation, knowing what didn't work in the past, are we trying to provide the clarity of what I would think would need like an expert opinion on what would give us the best chance of creating a successful mitigation moving forward, knowing what didn't work? Are we like talking about that level of detail by March, or just?
In my opinion, I don't think so. First off, I think that our department knows more about this mitigation than anyone else on earth. I don't think anyone else on earth has tried to conduct it. They might be the only people who have lived experience on it. So I guess that's one just practical element. I mean, this is just my personal opinion, but in March, I feel like there is some consensus coming here. Kurt, tell me if you feel like I've got this right, that there might be potentially a motion that listed a few things that are annexation related to, that we'd come to some unanimous agreement need to be on the table sooner than later, and would be helpful and informative to city council.
Yeah.
I also think that there's something to be said. Well, of course, it's my own idea, so I think it's something to be said, but another brief missive that says, perceptions of ecosystem cost transference, while difficult to put your finger on, do loom in the discussion, because this particular decision could go bigger than our board. And anyone who forgets that does that at their own peril. And so to basically say that looms large in our own commentators' minds, in our own minds. And because we can't just say, well, we don't understand what's going on with the riprap and the berm forever. And we can't paint a picture that long-term underinvestment in the ecosystem health at CU South has the potential to become a cost to Boulderites and all this, and that should be on the table in annexation.
There's at least context for annexation negotiations.
Great, and it'll take sensitive wording, but something like that. And then I guess going from there, then the way I see it is you've got our series of motions that are about mitigation. You've got some that are annexation related business. And then we start working towards putting together a document that puts a little bit more meat on the bone, item by item, that includes all of them. So, because everybody else in this thing has a term sheet, yet we're a critical landowner. At some point, they're going to need a concise resource better than our summary of motions to understand what the current headset on these requirements is.
So in the wording, if there was something, I would just be concerned that we make sure we communicate appropriately that, again, what worked in the past, what was tried in the past didn't work. And moving forward, I don't know if that's something, you know, obviously you could write 100 pages on how it could look, or say something that, you know, all basis for mitigation efforts would be based, evidence-based, you know, scientific data from present moving forward with certain type of like land management in mind. I'm just concerned that it would be construed, like you said, acre for acre, or the cost would only be in hard dollars as opposed to something a bit broader in perspective. I just want to make really sure that we word that appropriately so that everyone's aware of what we're talking about.
You know, Caroline, I think you're drawing a good connection to some of our previous motions that really, I think the logic maybe needs to be laid out more clearly if we do a near-term presentation about our interest-related annexation. And that is that one of the reasons we have insisted on the 119 acres, all of the OSO, is because of the uncertainty about mitigation and because of the uncertainty about groundwater transport and what will happen to the wet meadow areas. And so maybe drawing some of those connections will be helpful when we package up our interests related to annexation, which tends to focus particularly on the 119.
Dave, we haven't heard from you for a long time.
Yeah, I agree. I think that a couple of us probably need to volunteer to, you know, craft the draft to have in the packet so that we can, you know, have a focused discussion at the March 10th meeting. I mean, I think, you know, based on the conversation tonight and what, you know, we've talked about previously, I think there's enough knowledge between or among the board members that we don't have to belabor this much anymore. What we need to do is basically get it focused as clearly as we can, as comprehensively as we can, and take some kind of action.
Yeah, I agree. If others aren't driving towards hard commitments, it makes sense for us to, as a critical landowner in the project.
And I think given the timeline, the council seems, you know, intentional on moving ahead on at least the first reading in the next few months, and it would behoove us to, you know, kind of have our concerns on the table, you know, as that process moves ahead.
One other,
I fully agree with that because of the timing of the decisions that are going to start rolling out.
And my memory of the subcommittee meeting is that Dan basically previewed that. I don't remember exactly the word you used, but you said you would be able to come back, or that after our study session and our March meeting, we might have more detailed input. I forget exactly. It was in response to Rachel's question about, well, what's open space say at this point?
Yeah, I think the question was, I think staff put this together. Do the boards kind of feel like their area is represented here? And I think that's a little bit of where we're going. And my response was, well, we had on the agenda for March to walk through this, which we've already done. So that would be one of my questions before we leave tonight is, what is the discussion left in terms of the calendaring? If you all are thinking of a little bit more of a detailed annexation type of thing right now, that does beg the question of how you continue to work on some of these other things. And so is there still a March conversation about the calendar? Would be a question I'd want to just broach with you all before we left tonight.
Dan, can you tell all of us when items would be needed to put in the packet as Dave suggested? For a March 10th meeting?
Yeah, I mean, from a courtesy standpoint, we try to get everything out to you that Wednesday before, so a week before. But we've had lots of examples where it's notified on the agenda, so everybody knows we're speaking of it, but a material isn't ready, so it might go out that Friday, or it might even go out that Monday before the board meeting. So there's no sort of requirement. We try to get into that rhythm of getting you guys everything a week ahead of time. But if you're the ones developing it, there's a little, if you need all of next week to do it, and we put everything out on Wednesday, but then we add this and say this is an addition on Friday, that's a perfectly fine way to go too.
That's helpful. I just picked up my calendar and realized we're talking about next week.
Yeah. Yeah, and even if we got it out Monday before of the week of the board meeting, I mean, I think even your fellow hours probably would be sufficient, but.
So it could be posted on the web so that the public had access to it.
It would be, it might get posted later than everything else, I guess.
Yeah.
We're gonna post everything else on that Wednesday before,
Thank you. That's helpful.
but we'll put it on the agenda.
Yep.
This certainly argues, I think, in favor of a very clear focus on annexation issues for the March meeting, because I think we can probably get those packaged up in the time frame that we have, recognizing that the next big lift, excuse me, will be to revisit the flood project motions and get those brought up to date and up to speed. So anyway, that's my argument.
Yeah, and I'll just throw this out based on our conversation tonight. John and Don and I can huddle up too, and if we have any suggestions on this calendar or anything else to offer and as input, we can do that before the meeting as well. If we have any thoughts in March to offer in terms of 2021 and topics and conversation, we can put that out there too.
Yeah. I mean, for me, Dan, and I probably just understand it wrong, but the real heartburn for me comes in the fact that the way the timeline's set up, it sounds like an annexation could occur before disposal, and it seems like a desire to create a predetermined outcome. And I think I would imagine most board members would agree. We're not participating in a predetermined outcome. And if they want to invest tons and tons of money to build an annexation and agreement and think that we're going to be ultimately forced into an outcome, to communicate very early, think about your timeline however you want, but we're not going to enter a predetermined decision no matter where in the timeline it's put.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point, Hal. I can't speak for every council member, but the ones that I've worked with are fully aware of the open space matter. And I would also just throw in that they may be negotiating an annex agreement before CDOT's the other landowner. So you may have 2 of the 3 landowners that still have a loud voice
Yeah.
even after the main terms of the annexation agreement are put in place.
My art teacher used to always say, failure to prepare is preparing to fail.
Karen, one other benefit I see of this project is that it could allow some back of the envelope math to actually start to take place. I'm fearful that for certain people, the desire and rush to build this flood mitigation wall is kind of within the context of whatever it costs to the city of Boulder. And that's a little non-actionable in the real world. And I think we owe it to people to, at least if we're going to have requirements that have steep cost, to start to let them see what those costs look like. It's not fair otherwise. It's non-fiduciary.
No, I definitely agree with that, Hal. You know, and I've been kind of quiet, as Karen pointed out, because I'm greatly saddened by what's going to happen. I think we can do all the mitigation we want and, focus on all the efforts to make sure that things remain as they are. But the fact of the matter is that they aren't. And it's going to be a completely different area, and wildlife are going to be very highly impacted, and it's just going to be different. And I think we ought to at least pay attention to the fact that it's not going to be the same, and it's unfortunate. But it's that's happening all along the Front Range, and that's just the way it's going to be, I guess.
I feel that way too, Dave. I guess the way that I rationalize it is that as people with the details on this, trying to drive a really good deal and decision at the OSBT level is our primary goal, because it's what we can do.
Right.
And I rest a little easy knowing that if there's a huge mistake being made, the citizens ultimately have a very clear voice too. And so progress is made on 2 fronts, if that makes sense. I mean, I'll be the first to say it would be humiliating to have any disposal overturned by the citizens, because that's a total referendum on the quality of our work and understanding of our own chart. Nonetheless, somebody has to be in there trying to drive a somewhat hopeful mitigation outcome,
No, I agree. That's basically what we have to do. I'm just saying that it's just going to be different.
Okay, I'm thinking ahead now. I'm happy to have Karen and Hal try to draft this amazing statement, but I'm also willing to volunteer to be one of 2 people to do that for the March meeting. So I leave it to you to decide how you guys want to proceed with the drafting.
So
I'm wondering whether there could be 2 subcommittees.
you're thinking about annexation related items for a motion, and then you're thinking about a draft of a more formal document that actually expressly defines what has been in all prior motions. Is that correct?
Not just prior motions,
But yeah,
Right.
but a more formalized
but yeah, a
document.
more robust statement about all the considerations that we, as one of the 3 landowners, think are important.
And so if I understand, you're saying we're going to sort of separate annexation needs and flood project needs and get a subcommittee for each one of those.
Yeah, I think that's what's separating those 2 is what's been suggested. And I'm saying to myself, if we only have a week, maybe we need to divide and conquer and have two subcommittees, one working on the annexation part and one working on the, as Dan suggested, one working on the flood mitigation part. See where we can get.
In your initial draft of ideas, your 1 through 10, would it be difficult for you to look, do you think that from what you drafted, it's pretty half and half between annexation and flood?
No, I think that's more flood.
Or-
I think the annexation are the items that we went through in the beginning when we were going through the term sheet.
Okay, so all of the considerations on your idea, on the initial draft is all flood for you?
I think so.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm reading it right, because I just, it's all,
There's some overlap,
Yeah.
but
There's going to be overlap between these two
Yeah.
things. And I guess what I'm wondering about, Karen, is the March meeting. Should it be our goal to try to have motions that cover both annexation and variant one? I'm concerned
we
that it will be
could
almost
try. It's only a week though, as we've just pointed out.
I guess my gut feel is it would be really valuable to have a good statement coming out of the March 25th, I'm sorry, March 10th, of the annexation issues that are time critical for negotiations.
I just might throw in the political reality of it, is that council's headspace is, as you know, on so many issues, and what they're going to carve out their headspace for this whole project is annexation.
Yeah.
Just have a feeling like if we put something more on their lap about the flood project at this time, it may not get the oomph and the attention it deserves. And I'm not, if you all want to go for it, do it. I'm not trying to delay you in any form or fashion. I'm just trying to think of the headspace of where council's going to be at in the next 2 or 3 months, and what might have more of an impact at what time. So
I tend to really agree with Dan and Kurt on this one. Maybe, Karen, what do you think about a way forward of you working directly with Kurt related to annexation specific issues for the March meeting? And then we look towards April to basically combine what comes out of those motions and meet the muster of the board with these other items that kind of have either already met the muster with perhaps some additional tweaks. I know one thing of large concern is thinking about what can be done to disavow people of the idea that open space is a land bank. So they think twice about going down some of these roads earlier. But does that seem reasonable for the timeline? Because I know a lot of the stuff other than annexation, we can pop up pretty quickly.
And it occurs to me how one of the things we could say with our annexation motions is simply the observation that came out of the granite, which is it's the board's expectation that disposal will not occur in all of its details until maybe, I don't know if we say the 90% design, but we convey that that's the timeline that this is on, just so we start adjusting people's expectations that they're not going to get a disposal decision in October. And that carves out a little space for the board to keep working on fleshing out the variant one motions. We could take, Karen and I could take a whack at that. It would be sort of a context thing that would be added to the annexation needs.
It seems to make sense to me because you're talking about in March, giving council what they need that will be a benefit related to their direct discussions with CU. While as many of the flood things are actually negotiations with the city and utilities.
Right.
And are not as time pressing. And we can combine those as time passes so that the whole world has a clear view of where open space is on the holistic front.
Yeah.
And John and Don's work on creating some of these placeholders for discussions of 2021 is basically saying, are these the type of meetings and discussions you all are going to need to move into 2022 or whatever that time frame to start putting meat to the bones on a specific level? And so that's something for also you all to consider, and you could give us your observation on that more in March as well, as far as, are these the right subject matters and generally the right time frame and sequence? So just kind of bringing it back to the schedule, is this supportive of what you all feel like is moving you forward?
So if you need a head nod, Kurt, on your suggestion, I think that's fine.
And I wonder if we should maybe name the standing committee that Karen alluded to work on variant 1, because I would add to their tasks looking at the timeline. And so maybe Hal and one other board member could start looking at the timeline and come to the March meeting with any suggested changes for that. That's the longer term view, but we might as well get a committee established and get them started thinking. Because I think Dan's point is really good. Let staff know as early as we can what information you're going to want when, like say a briefing on groundwater.
I appreciate all the work that you guys have done. Knowing the last 8 weeks for me has just been a little bit more, a lot going on. But in the interest of making sure that this is done properly, my schedule in a week will substantially decline in current hours. But as it stands for another week, I'm still doing about a 60-hour week. So I would actually really like to be on this and doing it, but I don't think that I would be able to do a good job for another 7 to 10 days. So I just wanted to.
Well, maybe just for the March meeting, we should have Hal and Dave look hard at the timeline and come with suggestions. That doesn't mean that that committee can be a little fluid and others could join it and as we get further down the road, but maybe as a starting point for right now for the March meeting.
Yeah, I'm totally open to a handoff.
Okay, great.
Sounds
All
good.
right. Yeah, go ahead, Dave. What were you going to say?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, great.
So what I'm hearing is Dave and I think about the timeline, and Kurt, you and Karen work on annexation related item language.
Yeah.
And is there anything else for immediate planning for March that we've missed?
I do have some prior work that I can share with Karen regarding what you guys are doing. So maybe that can be helpful or whatever, but I'll let you take a look at it so I can contribute somewhat to that from prior stuff done.
Great, shoot it to me.
We'll have a chance to look at Don's work plan too, so that's always good.
Dan, I know we have other things on the March meeting. Does this seem to fit?
Yeah, I did some minor adjustments that I'll go over with you and Hal in order, just expecting that you all were going to come up with something for March. I made a little bit of a shift to clear out some space, so.
Great, thank you. Well, I got to say, it's been a fascinating discussion. I was skeptical about what additional issues we hadn't at least touched on, but when you turn Karen loose on these documents, things happen. And so you raised some really good issues. Thank you.
Yeah.
Like Dave, I'm really concerned about how much things are going to change.
Yeah, well, and as Hal said, and I think it's a really important point to keep coming back to, and of course, this is long after I'll be off the board, but the board's going to have a mitigation plan from staff that they really understand. And in spite of the fact that there will be limitations on the exact type of mitigation we might be able to do successfully, it's going to have to be a plan that the board is ready to try to sell to the citizenry, that we feel that good about it, that it could be seen as a real advancement in certain environmental functions in that area, even though mitigating each square foot may be really difficult. So I keep coming back to Hal's point about convincing the community and being ready to do that, that we have a plan that's we think that much of. And of course, it's all going to come down initially to what staff recommends and they feel can be accomplished. And then it gets to the issue of what funds will be available for that. So a lot of steps between now and then.
Yeah, my biggest concern about the separating things off that we've been talking about for the last 15 or 20 minutes is the need to be clear in the annexation agreement about the costs and how they're picked up. And we have all said to each other, there's not enough money in the open space fund to do this work. There's no well to go to. And maybe given Kurt your description of some kind of preface for this, that can still be included and conveyed to council. But I'm really concerned about that.
Well,
Yeah.
That is part of what I'm planning to bring to March, which is some very subtle language that tells council that a part of telling a story that's convincing to the community includes a perception of ecosystem cost, responsibility, and partnership. And that, I don't think we'll ever sell a story that doesn't include that.
And it's just a fact worth mentioning in case there is anyone listening that is like, all of this for 5 acres. Obviously, we have endangered species and habitat there, which makes it very high priority, but it is our 5 acres. However, according to the United States Forest Service, an estimated 6,000 acres of open space are lost each day. So it's at a rate of 4 acres per minute. We are only so big, so it will run out eventually. So it's just worth noting that the new concepts and ideas for really strategic land management, along with known climate change and what that will bring, is what we as a board are trying to do in pushing Boulder and our whole open space system forward in a way where we're exemplary and maybe influence others to do the same as well.
Well put. Okay, any other things, particularly Hal and Karen, want to cover in the study session? Again, I really appreciate all the work that was put into this. It's really valuable.
Yeah, I
So
think
thank you.
we thank Hal and Karen a lot. You guys did a nice job, and it was a good conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
I really appreciate everybody agreeing to have a study session because as Hal said at the beginning, we never get a chance to just talk to each other.
And it's a lot easier when other people do all the work.
Yeah.
Okay, well, with that, again, thanks to everybody and thanks to staff.
Thanks, Ben.
We really appreciate all your efforts, and thanks to the public to listen in on this. It's an important discussion. And with that, I think we are adjourned until our next meeting, March 10th.
And we don't have to say drive safe.
Yeah, isn't that great?
That's right.
I'm gonna go lift with
All
your
right.
legs.